Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CUHK Law and the latest in our property law seminar series. This is an unusual seminar for us. It's a long seminar. You don't have to stay with us for the whole of the seminar. We have 3 panels making up a seminar focusing on museums and collecting, so public and private collecting, all of the issues that can arise with regard to those. I'm joined today by 4 very distinguished panelists who are going to hopefully be available to discuss and perhaps answer questions on all of these different aspects of the panels. I will just mention that we have these 3 panels. There is a time schedule. So the first panel will be on building a collection, provenance, authenticity and conditions. And some of you may have noticed that at times there was a typo where provenance was spelled Provence. This was just to prove to everyone that it wasn't AI generated. Okay, so deliberate, no, it wasn't a deliberate error. Obviously, it was an error, but thank you for those who pointed out that typo at times as well. That panel will run until about 3:25. And then for the people who are here in person, we'll have a break. I think everyone needs a break after about an hour and a half or so. And then we'll be back at 3:35 for the second panel, maintaining a collection, security of collections. That'll run until about 4:45. Again, a short break, and then 4:55 till 6:10-ish or whatever else. Final panel, disposing of collections, conditions on donations, restrictions on access, mandated display, deaccessioning, and selling donations. So again, lots of things to do with museums, but lots of things to do with private collections as well, all those aspects. And again, even though we have got 3 panels, let me just say that probably we'll find some of the issues that come up within the panels recurring, because these things all do overlap as well. I should also, by the way, say welcome to CUHK Law on behalf of our Dean, Professor Shi Chow, who unfortunately is dealing with a few issues up at our LSK building up in Sha Tin on the campus there. Not bad issues, good issues, but things he had to deal with. And so he can't join us today. He also just got back late last night from the UK, so I think he would be a bit jet lagged anyway. But welcome to CUHK Law. So let me just very briefly, introduce our 4 panelists today. First, I have next to me a very distinguished collector, solicitor in Hong Kong, Mr. Angus Forsyth, also a very good friend of mine as well. So I'm very grateful that he's turned up today. Angus has expertise in many areas to do with law, but of course also with collecting. I think it's fair to describe Angus as a connoisseur, which I think is a word that's not used that much anymore, but someone who does appreciate, understand, have expertise in art and Chinese art in many forms, but particularly, of course, jade. On the biography that's available on the website, you'll have seen that the publications, Angus's work collecting and also researching into Chinese jades in many different ways. So, and new books coming out soon. Later on, he'll give us a little presentation about some work he's working on at the moment as well as part of the second panel. Then next to Angus, we have Florian Knothe from the University of Hong Kong. Florian is an associate professor there and director of the University Museum and Art Gallery. And again, I think Florian has expertise in a number of areas that can bring to bear on this panel. Obviously, we're looking at sort of a very distinguished private collector, a very distinguished member of the museum community. But again, I'm hoping that they'll be able to comment on other things as well. Lots of things to do with that. Thank you. Next to Florian, we have Professor Sarah Ward. She is a professor at Dalian Maritime University, strong links to Hong Kong in the past and hopefully in the future. And Sarah's expertise in marine archaeology, in safeguarding of cultural property. I'm hoping again that she'll be able to bring some of that expertise into the discussions we have about issues to do with the acquisition of cultural property and art and antiquities. And then again, issues to do with disposing of them as well. I think that'll be there. And then our final member of the panel, last but not least, definitely, is my very good friend, Toby Bull. Toby is now a PhD candidate at CUHK Law and previously a member of the Hong Kong police force for, was it 31 years? 31 years. Expertise in issues to do with law enforcement, to do with security, to do with art and antiquities. So Toby, well, again, I think all of our panelists, they all have expertise in particular areas, but I think they can join the discussions to do with all of these areas. I should say as well, thank you so much for so many people signing up. So we had nearly, I think, 1,100 people have signed up. Majority, thankfully, on Zoom. Otherwise, our rooms would be much too small for this. But we have got a very good crowd in this room as well in our moot court at GLC Bank of America Tower in central Hong Kong. But thank you so much for all those people who have signed up and joined us online as well. We will try and be as interactive as possible, see if there are questions in the room as we go through. But also for those of you online on Zoom, you can use the chat function to chat questions into us. And please feel free to do so at any point to chat the questions in, and then we'll try and either incorporate them as we're asking questions in the room or bring them in towards the end of sessions in a sort of Q&A at the end. So please feel free to send your questions in to us. So let's move into the first panel then. The first panel, as I said, building a collection. We put together a little PowerPoint just to raise some of the issues, just to put forward some of the things that we might want to discuss. Again, this isn't everything, and I will try and move through it quite quickly because I'd rather get our panelists talking about things than me talk about things. So here we are. If I can get the slides to work. Here we go. There we go, first one. I thought we'd start off, if we're going to talk about acquisitions to do with collections, particularly with institutional collections, then probably one of the most controversial collections in the world is, of course, well, what are referred to as the Elgin or the Parthenon marbles. These marbles that they didn't all come from the Parthenon are now held in the British Museum and in other museums. Some of these marbles went to other museums as well, around Europe usually, but very controversial. I think most people in the world know about this sort of the issue of Greece has been trying to claim these marbles back for many years. Various dialogues opened with the British Museum, with the British government at times. At one point a few years ago, it did look like there was an agreement for them to go on possibly a permanent loan back to Greece, but that sort of politics always rears its ugly head. Politics often leads to the return of items, but it also causes problems as well. So we can start by thinking about these. And if we're mentioning the British Museum, I think this is one of my favourite jokes to do with the British Museum. Which of course is this representation of the British Museum gift shop, where I don't know if you can read that very small writing. It says, "I know this is wrong, but look how cute those keychains of stolen artifacts are." Again, maybe we can talk about how unfair that is on the British Museum at times as well. I think I should stand up for the British Museum a little bit.
I will.
Thank you. That's Florian. That's what we need. And that brings us into other disputed heritage, which is in private collections as well. And things like the Zodiac Fountain from the Old Summer Palace. All of the issues that happened with the sacking of the Old Summer Palace as well. Of course, Lord Elgin in charge there, Lord Elgin in charge with the Parthenon marbles, members of the same family. This is why I think the French call looting Elginism, I think is the term they actually use for it. So the family have a reputation. Again, there's a photograph of the Old Summer Palace, or an engraving, and then a photograph of the modern Summer Palace. We should bring in the issue, by the way, of changing attitudes to do with looting, and also to do with things like archaeology. We have to sort of consider this idea of, at one point, what was originally termed grave robbing. I mean, archaeology today, many of the things that archaeologists remove, that they put in museums, of course, many of these things come from graves. And the people who were buried in those graves, they didn't want people to take things from their graves. They didn't want anything removed. So, of course, this is a photograph of the intact seal of King Tutankhamun's grave when it was discovered by Carter. And again, the controversy of archaeology and modern archaeology. We do want to say that museums have done very good things. And one of the museums that we can point to that probably has done a very good thing, of course, is the National Palace Museum in Taipei. As has been noted many times, because of the political events in China in the 1960s and 70s, many wonderful things could have been destroyed. So there's controversy about these things, but the museums have done very good things. And that leads me into another issue where I'm going to pass over to Toby. I'll control the slides, but Toby can talk to you about the issues to do with the removal of those treasures from mainland down to Taiwan. Oops. I think we've got the wrong slides, Jay. Sorry. Maybe we can load those later on. Sorry, Toby. It looks like we've missed the slides out on these ones. We'll come back. Toby's got an issue to talk about there to do with fakes, really, to do with that. Do you want to talk about it briefly, Toby, without the slides, or?
It's better with the slides.
Okay, we'll try and get the slides up for a bit later on then. I'll find them later. Thank you. Anyway, so moving on to the next issues to do with this, we have, of course, a number of issues to do with museums more recently facing issues to do with where their collections were acquired. Cases where museum staff were actually accused of crimes. So one of the most famous, of course, was Marion True, the former curator of antiquities at the J. Paul Getty Museum in California, where in Italy they put out an arrest warrant for her, staged a trial for her as well, because they said that she was complicit with other members of the museum community in actually purchasing items that had been looted from Italy with knowledge of the fact that they'd come from Italy as well. Again, the museum community is trying to take more care. We see now where we have private collectors trying to give their collections to museums and being told, well, where did you actually get these things? Where did you actually obtain these items? And this particular gentleman was trying to, it seems, give some of his collection to a museum where he was told, well, actually, we need more provenance than you just bought them in Hong Kong 15 years ago, which, again, will bring us on to other stories to do with people trying to dispose of their collections a little bit later on. If we are thinking that museums are being more cautious, though, we've got some very high-profile cases where things have, again, gone wrong. Many people will know about the National Australian Gallery and the issue of the red sandstone Buddha figure on the left there, and then the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York on the right with the golden sarcophagus. Two very prominent cases where it was discovered that, well, on the left, the sandstone figure had been acquired from one of New York's most distinguished antiquities dealers, Nancy Weiner, and again, subsequently, Indian authorities identified that this had been looted from a temple in India. When more investigation is carried out, of course, it is discovered that the item has also been passed to Nancy Weiner by Subhash Kapoor, and these are two names now that are well known in the world for unfortunately being involved with looted and stolen antiquities. So very, very distinguished members of the art dealing and antiquities dealing community being subject to prosecutions, both of them. Here we go, Subhash Kapoor and Nancy Weiner. The other item there, the golden sarcophagus, again, some of you may remember the story of this. Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased the golden sarcophagus, put it on display in their museum. Unfortunately for the Met, they have an assistant DA in New York who's made it his sort of business to sort of check up on everything that's coming through New York. I think there are many antiquities dealers in the world who don't go to antiquities shows in New York anymore because of this particular assistant DA. And he questioned this, and the Egyptian authorities, when they checked up again, said there'd been no export licenses. They had no record of this. So the presumption is that this has been looted. And that can bring us on to that question of today, is there a presumption that with antiquities, they're guilty and you have to prove innocence with them? I think that's something that perhaps many private collectors, many institutional collectors are worried about today. So that's it. I should put this letter up as well. I don't know, it's so small, I'm afraid many of you won't be able to read it. But this was the letter of provenance that was given to the National Australian Gallery, the Australian National Gallery, with the red sandstone Buddha. it's so small, I don't think even I can read it now, but it's interesting for us because this seems to be a letter that was created by Subhash Kapoor as part of a provenance trail for that particular Buddha. And it names a gentleman called Mr. I. Donaldson or Ian Donaldson. And his address is in McDonald Road in Hong Kong. And the statement he says there is that he purchased this particular figure sometime in the 1960s from a shop in Hong Kong. It's an interesting part of a provenance trail that it seems was created by Mr. Kapoor. The interesting facts being, well, three really. The first is that Mr. Kapoor knew enough that he realized that in Hong Kong, we still have the doctrine of market avert, which means that if you do buy something from a shop or a market in Hong Kong in good faith, but it turns out later on to have an issue with its title, to perhaps be stolen or looted, well, then market avert says that you can gain good title to this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is dating it back to the 1960s, of course, predates the international conventions that usually operate and that museums today usually require provenance to date back before the 1970 date line of the convention to do with the export and import of cultural property. So he knew enough to date that back. And then, of course, the third thing is that apparently this gentleman did exist. So he'd done his provenance, his research, and actually identified someone who was known in Hong Kong as well as part of that provenance trail. But it turned out to be, of course, false. I'll also mention Douglas Latchford. He was a well-known prominent collector of Cambodian antiquities. He was involved with experts, academic experts in the United States in the publications to do with Cambodian antiquities as well. He died back in 2020. At the time, he was, of course, being investigated on charges of being involved with looted items on the international art market as well. He had sold many items to very distinguished museums as well. And of course, those museums are now trying to check up on the provenance to do with them. I will just show you a photograph. Some of you will have been to Thailand. If you go north of Bangkok and go there, you will see, of course, in that wonderful complex, the old city, the temples there, you will see these rows of decapitated figures. I think that's the thing we've got to think about with where things come from today, which are sold to private collectors and museums in Asia. And if we're talking about issues to do with private collectors, again, many people will know the story of this particular monk figure. This is roughly 1,000 years old, a figure of a monk from southern China. It emerged coming up for about 12 years ago now, 11 or 12 years ago. A lot of international attention on this figure focused because, of course, a private collector in the Netherlands had purchased it. He sent it for some restoration. And while they were restoring the figure, his restorer discovered that at the bottom where he was trying to restore it, there were human bones inside. And this is one of those figures where you actually get a human skeleton, which is then encased in gesso and then gilt over the top of it. And it was the figure of a monk. It was a human being that had then been encompassed in this. Now, of course, that's very interesting in many ways. It also makes it quite valuable as well as an antiquity. It attracted, as I said, a lot of media attention. And of course, then we had some villagers in southern China saying, that's our monk. That's the monk that was stolen from our temple. And the dispute over that in the courts in the Netherlands was, of course, quite frustrating. In the end, the courts in the Netherlands ruling that the villagers in southern China didn't have any standing to actually bring a claim for the figure. The collector in the Netherlands refusing to acknowledge any sort of jurisdiction of the courts or anything else, and then saying at one point, well, anyway, I've sold it anyway, so you couldn't get it back to me. It was an interesting thing to say because I've usually found that courts in common law jurisdictions, if you say that to a judge in a common law jurisdiction, they usually get quite angry if you say you've got no jurisdiction, and they usually find a way to have jurisdiction. So, but anyway, in the Netherlands, they decided not to proceed with everything. And then we had a really interesting case in China, where a court in China decided that they did have jurisdiction and that they would give a ruling, their ruling being based upon a new concept. They said in international law, the Lex 30, the law of where the item was stolen from, and declaring in favor of the villagers that the item should be returned. Now, of course, they made that order it can't be enforced. But it was an interesting way of them actually looking at developments to do with the law. I should just mention, of course, the issue of fakes, which is what Toby hopefully will talk to us about a little bit later on. For private collectors and museums, the issue of authenticity is, of course, a very important point. And again, museums, well, there's been some bad publicity to do with a number of museums over the last few years. This particular museum in Hebei, of course, one of these multiplicity of museums that have been built in China over the last years. A huge building program to do with public and private museums in China. This was one of the museums that attracted attention for all the wrong reasons, though, because, of course, when it opened and people started to look at the collection, it was a bit, some of the things were a little bit suspicious. The fact that some of the items were meant to be very old, but they had simplified Chinese on them, or they had cartoon characters, attracted a bit of attention at the time. So museums have to be very careful. Again, other museums have been found to have items that are not authentic. And so again, questions being raised. This is one of my favorite stories to do, though, with museums and fakes. This was the Chinese librarian who had faked a number of very attractive Chinese artworks with calligraphies and everything else, had replaced the real things in the library in which he worked with his fakes. But in the end, got upset and sort of reported himself because he realized that someone had replaced his fakes with other fakes and they weren't as good as his fakes. So, you know, this again is why we need Toby to talk about fakes, because faking is just such an interesting area. And museums, of course, private collectors, it's a real worry. It's part again of the whole sort of idea of it. Toby, do you want to talk to this particular image?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So obviously this looks like from first glance, a Liechtenstein. It's actually done by an art forger who was party to one of the biggest art frauds cases in the 20th century. And his name was John Myatt. And so I actually own this painting. So that's my, I declare that in advance. But so I met John 2 years ago when we were both talking at an art crime conference, and we were on the same panel. And he's a really interesting guy. I mean, yes, criminal, yes, done his time, but he's now making a career out of painting genuine fakes. And the genuine fake is actually how he termed his enterprise at the very beginning. So he's an art teacher, and in the early 90s, he was trying to make ends meet, and he put an advertisement in the back of a British satirical magazine called Private Eye, and he called it Genuine Fakes, and I will do a painting in the style of an artist that you choose, £150. And before long, a man approached him called John Drew and asked him for a painting in a particular style, and he did that several times. And then he came back to John Myatt and said, hey, you wouldn't believe it. I sold one of your paintings to Sotheby's for £25,000. And you know, John Myatt was aghast. But unfortunately, before long, necessity and normal reasons for people doing these things, money, greed, etc., etc. It was before long he basically put about 200 pieces into the art market, using things like emulsion paint and KY jelly, which is a hardener, and so he could actually turn these things quite quickly. And there was one time he was standing at John Drew was very clever. He was getting access because he'd built up a reputation amongst libraries and with auction houses. And he started to actually get unsupervised access to a lot of archives and provenance records. And he started to insert false provenance listing to paintings that John Myatt had made. And before long, when they would come up to sales, auction houses, if anyone was doing a cursory due diligence check, they would see these records in the archives. and this helped perpetuate the whole scam. So before too long, to cut a long story short, it got noticed. John was arrested and said that he would cooperate. So in 1995, he was arrested by a good friend of mine, head of the Art and Antiques Squad, London at that time. And he was done for conspiracy to defraud and was sentenced to not very long for how much damage you'd think that he'd done to the art market. And they still haven't recovered all of his works. Out of the 200, maybe at that time, 45 or so had been recovered. He served for 4 months only in jail, and then helped put John Drew away, who got a longer term. But when he came out, he then decided to go straight. And so he went back to what he was originally doing, which is creating these genuine fakes. So this particular, and he's making a decent career out of it now. And his actual artworks are becoming collectibles in themselves. Hence, I saw this in a rather posh London gallery and fell for it. With the backstory, the fact that I knew him, I knew the person who had arrested him. So I've got a kind of, and also Lichtenstein's one of my favorite artists. So I have that connection to this. But it's quite clear. I mean, the Brad, those bubble pictures with "Hey Brad" and things. Yeah, he's just changed this to suit the subject and what he does. But fascinating story. There's always, you have to remember, I mean, it is a crime first and foremost. I'm not trying to make light of it, don't condone it. People have been victims in this, but I would say that he has done his time. He is now honest in his work. He's very talented. There's no two ways about it. And there's always a story behind these sort of art crimes.
Good. Thank you, Toby. I think, it's very interesting, isn't it, that the provenance for your painting is, I know the man who arrested the artist. Sort of, it definitely is an interesting thing. I think your point, and I'll come to the panel, ask a few questions about these things later on, but your point about that often when people are involved in these crimes, and they are crimes, as you say, people do lose, they have been defrauded, they don't go to prison for very long. If they do go to prison at all, the artists don't go to prison for very long. And often when they come out, they become very famous. It sort of launches a career for them in many ways. So it's a subject for a panel all of its own at some point. We need to talk about that. But there we go. I just put a bit up about provenance, of course, on the basis of this. A record of ownership of works of art or an antique used as a guide to authenticity or quality. For me, it's the guide for title as well, to make sure that people have got the right to ownership of it. That leads into everything from stolen to looted items as well. And a few things that maybe we'd want to talk about later on. When I was, so I should say, before I switched over to law, I was an antiques dealer as well. So for me, a good provenance was important, because to have a good backstory, often you got a better price for things. The story behind it was often very important. If something was associated with a famous collection or collector, that would be something important as well. Today, things have changed. The law has changed. Attitudes have changed. Today, it may be embarrassing, as it says there, or even unacceptable to own something because of the provenance or lack of provenance of an item, or because of associations with particular donors. So again, many people will know that museums in America who all benefited from the Sackler family they've all now tried to scrub the names off the buildings and everything else. One of your donors gets a bad name, now there's a problem. You've got to sort of retreat really from your associations with them as well. And of course, we should talk about changing attitudes and laws. Maybe Sarah later on can talk a little bit about this when we talk about the fact that quite a few years ago, I was very happy to be buying wreck porcelain from some of the famous Chinese and other wrecks in the Asia Pacific region that have been recovered by Captain Mike Asher and others. But now people are a little bit more cautious about these particular items as well. So I think, let's see, I think that's meant to end the presentation. But Should be the last slide, I think, Jay. Thanks. Yeah, I think so. Great. So maybe we can start by talking a little bit about that issue of items and their provenance today. Maybe we can start with first of all with Florian and then Angus talking about this. You know, after recent scandals, and we can again think about the things like the red sandstone Buddha and the golden coffin in the Met. What now counts as good enough provenance for an acquisition, let's say, for a museum? Florian?
Well, I think, first of all, you made a good point in saying that it was, for the longest time, used by the art market to beef up the importance of the object and the value. And I think we've long since, at least at museums, but I think also art dealers, saw other values in the provenance, right? The ownership records and trace of where objects come from, right? So I think for museums, it very much depends on their collection, what they collect, right? We sometimes discuss in class that many museums are not in danger of this at all. They collect art that is not prone to come from countries where looting happened or so on. And I think for all other museums, it's still a very dark area. Many museums, as you know, especially the more wealthy private museums in the West, have spent a lot of money to develop research departments, provenance research departments. And I think they employ specialists that know Cambodia very well in other areas of the world, and they pay a lot of attention to it. What counts as a good provenance, I think, is a hard question to answer. It depends on the object. Of course, it has to be truthfully dealt with. But I think with many objects that go back a long time, it is really difficult to have a proper ownership history.
And yes, I think you're quite right. Maybe we could now hand over to Angus and ask Angus, for a private collector, you know, how important is the provenance today?
I don't know about today, but 40 years ago, well, when I first came to Hong Kong, I was on a salary which was rather low, and I was interested in Chinese art and ceramics, but I couldn't afford to buy any of it. It was all for sale in London and New York. So I turned to Southeast Asian ceramics, and I got very interested in the ceramics of Thailand and also Thailand. And they were being found in various tombs in Southeast Asia, because the trading history of Southeast Asia is basically run by Chinese. So congratulations to Chinese for going all over the place, collecting little things in all these places and dying, and they're all put into their tombs. So these tombs were being emptied in the early 70s when I was collecting. And I would go to Thailand and the Philippines and buy in antique shops very wonderful things. So I put together a collection of these, and then one day, Jessica Rawson, who was at that time the head of Chinese ceramics in the British Museum, came to my flat together with the director of the Frog Museum in Washington. And they looked around at various things and said, very nice, very nice. And then Jessica said, well, what would you like to leave anything to the British Museum? And I said, well, I do have my collection of Thai ceramics because it's gathering dust now and I never look at it. So would you like that? She said, oh, yes, that'd be very nice. So in the end, I gave them 200 pieces of medieval Thai ceramics, and they were very happy to receive it. For a couple of cases in what was then the Edward VII Gallery in the back of the British Museum, they put them in 2 cases there, and I was very happy to see them there, and it said Provenance, Angus, Forsyth, and so on. So then the time came when Joseph Ho Tung was benefiting the British Museum. He provided a great deal of money for entirely new showcases. So I got a letter from the British Museum saying, awfully sorry, we're very happy to have your Thai ceramics, but we'd be reorganizing the entire gallery courtesy of Sir Joseph, and your ceramics are going into store. So I thought, well, you know, what do you do? I mean, you give something to the museum and you're very happy to receive it, and then you're told it's going into store and will never be seen again. So the other story about provenance is one I was telling to some of my fellow panelists earlier on, where the famous American lawyer, lawyer for Klaus von Bülow and the black basketball.
O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson, exactly right. Very clever New York lawyer. He collected Egyptian antiquities, and he got a large Egyptian stonework, sculpture, and decided he didn't want to have it anymore, so he wanted to sell it. So he bought it, having bought it from Sotheby's about 5 years previously, he took it back to Sotheby's and said, I would like to sell this. They said, what's the provenance? He said, I bought it from you. He said, no, what is the provenance? So he kept it.
I think I'm looking around to see if we've got anyone from the auction houses here. I don't think maybe they'd like to comment later on, but I mean that shows the changing attitudes. Things have changed. It's changed for the institutions. It's changed for those who are doing the dealing as well. But Toby, you mentioned about due diligence. How can people check up the due diligence now if they're buying?
Well, I could actually throw this to the room because we have here in the room somebody from the Art Loss Register, and so maybe can have a discussion open up in a minute. But to a couple of things on provenance that I would like to touch on. One is the traditional aspects of provenance, and the other is, which I'm sure people are thinking about these days because you're using it in all sorts of different ways, is AI. So let's go with the original traditional way of provenance, authenticity, in my view, and several others out there. So I think first and foremost, you should look at the art historical aspects to it. Really, you have people that are the experts. I'm not talking about their connoisseurship at this point. I'm just talking about to get the art historical feeling of when this piece was supposedly created, and looking at perhaps if that artist had workshops, looking at who his pupils were, students, and really get a feel for that aspect. And then you want to have deep dive into the actual historical records, so that would be into archives, really looking at if there are any gaps in that history, and also in the ownership history, as far as you can. And not everything is transparent to be able to find. Then I would look at a sort of comparative analysis where you're looking at all different handling of that artwork, and the techniques behind that how that artwork was made. And then fourthly, very importantly, of course, when you put all these things together, is the forensic testing. And that can be, there's many different ways of depending on what your piece is. If it's a wood panel, you can do dendrochronology, which is looking at the rings of the wood. You can put things under all sorts of microscopes to look at pigment analysis and layering, how the thing was made. And then I would say at that point, once you have sort of done this part of the due diligence, and of course it's not necessarily one person doing all of this, there are experts in all these different fields, but then you would go to the what I call the connoisseurship, and then you would go for the expert analysis. And putting all those things together, I think then you're looking at that is what good due diligence should be. On the connoisseurship alone, highlighting that, I think history has shown that a one-person view is dangerous, especially when it goes to we're a faculty of law, so especially when it goes to court. It's been shown that art experts will argue with each other just like lawyers. So you'll have different sides, no matter how eminent the expert is. So I would say for proper provenance, due diligence, all five things.
Good. I don't think lawyers argue. They submit, but they don't argue.
I stand corrected. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer.
I know we've got quite a few lawyers in the room, so I think that's it. But maybe Sarah, you can come in from an archaeologist's point of view. How do you think? What sort of due diligence, in particular, maybe institutions, should they be undertaking today?
Well, I actually agree with Toby, and I was glad to hear Toby running through kind of all 5 steps, because I know there's discussions around whether there should be scientific testing or not. I feel if we're looking at antiquities that aren't necessarily art, and for an archaeologist, this is, I think, quite important to separate out art from antiquities, even though in many fields they're considered the same thing. Now, like the ICOM code, for example, if we're talking about museums, says nothing should be acquired unless the museum or institution is satisfied that there's valid title, which you've talked about, and make every effort, as Toby has said, to establish the full history. There are similar, I think, guidelines in Australia, but if we come back to shipwreck and underwater cultural heritage material, I'll be honest, I think there's probably 5 museums in the world where we know, not only through kind of these 5 steps, but that the material in the museum is authentic to that site. The Mary Rose Museum in the UK, Vasa Museum, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Vasa is also in Sweden. And then we have other museums that suggest that they might be, the objects might be from one individual shipwreck. There's a certain very famous shipwreck in mainland China. That's one of these, where if we do not know where the shipwreck is, then to my mind, that puts the whole provenance question up in the air. We might know the objects came from that one shipwreck, but if the shipwreck isn't where the institution has suggested it is, i.e. it might be in international waters, it might not be in the territorial waters of one nation, or there's a questionable example in Singapore at the moment, where there's 2 very famous shipwrecks that have been touted as coming from Singaporean waters near Pedro Branca Reef. But allegedly, because we are a room full of lawyers, that reef might not be in Singapore territorial waters, it might be in Malaysia's. So I think for me, that puts the provenance of that material into question, because we do not know and cannot verify where that material came from, even if it's told that it's come from one particular wreck. So that's not something that's necessarily considered in those kind of 5 categories. But if we don't know where in the water it is, then how do we really know that that provenance is accurate? And I guess this raises the question of treasure hunting. And sorry to throw my friends in Singapore into the mix once again, but there's a very interesting example that many of you will know about the Tongue shipwreck, or the Balatung shipwreck as it's called, where the wreck was treasure hunted. I know the individual who's responsible for that. I've had many conversations with him. It opens up further questions about ethics versus legality. You know, in Indonesia at the time that this shipwreck was excavated, it wasn't illegal to do so, but it wasn't done archaeologically. So for an archaeologist, that's ethically inappropriate. And now Angus is getting uncomfortable. Sorry, Angus. The material was sold at auction. A museum has bought that, and it's now in their Maritime Archaeology Gallery, but nothing about that example is maritime archaeology. And again, we don't know, we can't provenance that material because we don't know where the shipwreck is. Only the people that recovered that material know where the shipwreck is. And if there's any archaeologists in the audience, you'll know it's not enough to know that it came from a particular shipwreck. We need to know where in that shipwreck it has come from. So for me, there's bigger questions here. Yes, the 5 steps, absolutely. But if we get to the end of the 5 steps and we can prove it's, you know, of this age, and we have the history of that, but if the originating position is unknown, then we still don't have kind of provenance.
Thank you.
Controversially.
No, this is what the panel is all about, and you know, it's only the people in this room and the 700 online. So what you like, it's fine. Well, that's maybe a few people in Singapore as well. So.
Pretending.
But maybe we'll go back to sort of institutions. And I don't want to, Florian, I don't want you thinking you've got to speak for everyone. But today, obviously, with those examples of, these quite famous items now, quite recently acquired by very important museums around the world, turning out to having issues with their provenance, and then having to be returned. It must be a big issue for museums to think about how far they have to go, just being purely risk averse in not wanting to be involved in any way with any of these things. Museums will still be buying from auctions and from dealers, and for the Met and for, of course, the Australian National Gallery as well, they were buying from very reputable dealers at the time. So how far does a museum have to go into sort of looking behind a reputable dealer or questioning something that comes up in an auction? Do they have to check now?
Well, you described the steps. I just wanted to add to that we are now very aware of these steps and of looking into the provenance, right? But I think many of the provenance issues that are discussed and that museums are having difficulties with are 19th and 20th century problems that when people thought different or didn't think about it or thought very differently about it. And so the documentation was done very differently. I'm not saying that to defend the museums, but I think it changed a lot in the last generation. And so the sad thing is, as you point out, museums are still buying things without proper provenance. But I think they are probably buying a lot less and they are being a lot more careful than they have been for the last 300 years. And so I think, not just to put a positive spin on it, but I think museums and museum professionals are doing a lot better now. And that also means probably that the forgers of provenance material are doing a lot better. But I think it all being more in the public, museums having felt, I assume, very embarrassed about some of the cases in more recent years when all of this is better known. I think there's more care taken. And at the same time, the reputable networks that you also referred to have always been really important. And I think many institutions, many museum professionals are rethinking that too, unfortunately or fortunately.
I think your point there raises something else maybe we'll come to later on, but the art world and the antiquities world works in a particular way. It's always been a world of trust for amongst the dealers and everything else. It was always where, people's word meant something, and people did trust and build relationships as well. And of course, you do get some people who betray trust. I think that's what happened with the Sebastian Core and everything else. Those ideas, they were, many people would have, Nancy Weiner, her mother, they were very distinguished antiquities dealers. Latchford as well. Yeah. So there we go. But maybe we can come on to. Oh, sorry. Do you want to?
I just wanted to say one thing to that, because we just survived the pandemic a few years ago, and I think the way the art market slowed down during those years, because people couldn't travel to see the objects themselves. And they could only rely on images and word of mouth, if you like, is a good sign for what you just explained, that people are quite willing to do more research, to look at the objects and the history themselves. And when that was less possible 5 or 6 years ago, the market suffered, if you like, because the exchange of art slowed down.
Yes.
But I think to add to something that Florian said is that, and about how museums or collectors bought and did their own due diligence back in the day. By that, I mean, sort of before computerization and being able to check various archives online and things, is that the gaps that are there naturally because of the difficulty in how some people just didn't think it was important sort of 100 years ago. This has now created a fertile area for, again, fakes. But what fakes of what? We're talking the fake provenances because of the that exact thing, which is gaps in the history. So we're seeing fake invoices, fake ownership, histories, gallery receipts, and these are things that can pass, a cursory human check quite easily. And what's worse is they're all being produced in seconds. There's some really, really good fakes out there. So I mentioned earlier with the case of John Drew, who actually did it the old-fashioned way, which was insert fake records and ownership histories and things into the provenance, into the archives, into books. That was the old-fashioned way. Now it's a much more dangerous world because of exactly the exploitation. You said as the records checking gets better, then Florian mentioned, of course, that those who are on the dark side, the criminals, are getting smarter too.
And now they're assisted by AI as well. AI generated provenance, I take it. That would be the thing. But maybe now, sort of you talking about these collections that were formed in the past, maybe again we can turn to Angus. So of course the British Museum, it was last year, it was announced that the Percival David Foundation had made a permanent gift of a collection that they that had been loaned. I think it was a 15-year loan to the British Museum. That was a collection that was formed. Well, I think he died in the 1960s.
By Percival David.
Yes.
Who was for a long time a resident of Beijing, where he bought many very valuable pieces smuggled out of the imperial palace to his willing, ready, able hands, and then taken back to London and forming the David collection. That's the strength of the David collection now in the British Museum. So provenance goes back a long way, and the further it goes back, the more suspicious it becomes.
I mean, in some ways, do you think that should the British Museum have accepted the gift?
Well, time is a good healer. I think the longer it takes, the better it is.
It's a wonderful collection.
It's a wonderful collection.
It's a wonderful collection.
And the pieces themselves, we have to distinguish, of course, in many ways, we're being misled a bit by provenance. We have to look at authenticity in two separate issues. Authenticity is very important, and authenticity is not the same as provenance. The two go together, but they're separate.
Yes, we've been talking about the different things. The provenance is useful for the issue of the title, of again, any issues that come with the title, but also, again, with the authenticity issues as well. And maybe we can go back to, then take it back to Florian, because, I mean, that's one of the problems, isn't it? You sort of mentioned about this idea that some of those museums, some of the older museums, Toby said there's literally a lack of any sort of provenance in things where things came from. So those older museums, a lot of them are addressing this, but have they got now, do you think, a duty to check at those sort of legacy collections, the collections that come from 50 or 100 or 200 years ago?
Absolutely. I think so. But as a museum professional, I also see the challenges with that. Right, you see that only the most wealthy of museums have been able to employ provenance researchers. So the time and money commitment, the resources are difficult to come by. And we all know that working in our sector. And I discussed this in our class when a government ratifies an international law and wants to be part of that community and prohibit the transfer of illicitly traded goods and so on. Once it trickles down to the museums to check their collections, they need to come up with the resources and the knowledge, if you like, to do that. And I think we all agree that it is an absolute must for museums to do so, but I see the challenges. Absolutely. And the older the museum, the harder it gets, you could argue, or depending on their collections, right? If they were formed at a specific time, and many 19th century institutions in particular suffer from that, then they were set up in a way that we find maybe a little bit problematic already, right?
I think that's it with many of them. And of course, as you say, they also suffer from a sort of surfeit of riches as well. They've often got such extensive collections. We saw that with the British Museum, of course, and the issues of not really knowing what it had in its collection at times, still not being sure of exactly what's there. and what still is there, as we'll talk about maybe in a second.
Exactly. And
There are thousands of items that are uncatalogued, unresearched, and waiting for knowledge to come to them. And
Yeah.
that's an endless story.
I think that's
and the provenance research and history of collecting field is comparatively young,
Yeah.
right? So it's a great field for us to grow, but it is of huge importance. And the more prominent cases make it more interesting, maybe, but there's a lot that is not, described by the newspapers.
Mm.
Mhm.
And for the provenance research, it's definitely an interdisciplinary thing, isn't it? Because we're not just talking about the sort of museum professionals, it's the archaeologists, even historians, and those who are now researching into the history of provenance as well. There are people
And the art market, right?
in the art market. as well.
And there are to my knowledge, very few national laws that oblige art dealers to do due diligence.
No, as I can testify from the United Kingdom, it was always a strange thing when people would ask about whether you needed to be licensed or anything else to be an art and antiquities dealer. And in the UK, no. It was strange, by the way, because when I went to work in France, then they did have a sort of registration system. But in the UK, there was no registration system, much more regulated. Sarah?
I wanted to come back to that point about authenticity, because it is in the definition of provenance. But in my experience and in recent conversations we've been having with colleagues across Asia, this is a very Eurocentric approach to, I'll say, cultural heritage, in that authenticity is about the materiality and the integrity and intactness of fabric, whether that's archaeological remains or a statue, is kind of essential to the European notions of heritage significance. But it's not essential to many Asian notions of heritage significance. I've spent many years working in mainland China, and we talk about fakes, and there's fake factories in China, and arguably there's fakes, to use that word, in many Chinese museums, but they're purposefully in Chinese museums because the Chinese kind of cultural perspective, and I know I'm a white woman, Anglo-Australian white woman talking about Asian values, like I'm very aware of my
Eurocentricity when you're
my positionality in all of this, and Steve is on this council for Asian Underwater Cultural Heritage as well, and it's been a real topic of consideration, is that in some cultures, maybe to generalize this a little bit, the integrity and the intactness of fabric, the authenticity of the material culture itself is not important. They're trying to demonstrate a continuity of history and a continuity of culture, and doesn't matter if that Tang vase was made in the Tang dynasty or it was made last year, because we're still looking at the same style, the same belief systems that go into that kind of object. But if we're the British Museum or an Australian archaeologist, we think if that, and actually most significance assessment processes globally are born out of a European philosophy, and integrity and intactness of fabric will impact the ranking of significance, how significant something is. So you think it raises these different questions then when we talk about authenticity. My training taught me that if it didn't have high integrity and intactness of fabric, or we could improve the date, then it was less significant. But to many other cultures, that's irrelevant. It's a demonstration of that intangible social practice that created this object that might be the same in the Tang Dynasty as it is in the fake factory in 2026. So does it matter if that object behind that glass cabinet was made 1,000 years ago or yesterday, if it's in the same design, from the same clay, created on the same wheels in Jingzhen with the same traditional glazes? But again, online, this is perceived to be a really contrarian point of view.
It is when those pieces then get sold as originals, right? So that this is it, right? Especially in Jingdezhen, where people are impacting, shards into the bottom of newly created ceramics, So.
And this is the challenge then. I think if we know what we're dealing with, and that's back to the kind of provenancing steps, then this is okay. But if there's kind of and again, there's many lawyers in the room, but I would say if there's a willful desire to deceive, that's very different than saying, hey, look, this is in the style, and we're trying to show you the continuity of culture. We're not pretending that this is original Tang or an original Van Gogh.
But then we're talking about, this panel's about sort of collecting this afternoon. So as soon as you sort of, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, but for a collector, then of course there's only value in it. It's not how it looks. It's not its aesthetic or how it was made, whether it was made the same way 1,000 years ago, or it's actually about its art historical value. So on this collecting head, then it's a very different answer, isn't it?
Angus?
As a collector, let's let Angus come in on there. As a collector, do you collect modern things as well as old things? Or?
I hope not. I hope I don't collect modern things. But I'll be saying a few things about jade, which is one thing I've been concentrating on for nearly 50 years. And jade is unerodable. It's a very hard material. On the Mohs scale, which was put together by a German chemist, ranging from carbon as the soft bottom of the Mohs scale, diamond is the top. 6.7 is nephrite, which is what I've been collecting for 50 years. So it's a very, very hard material, not only hard, but as a felted structure. So when Michelangelo was banging away at Carrara marble, splitting off bits and pieces to make different things, you can't do that with nephrite. It's a felted structure, so you can't have a plane of cleavage. So to find authentic nephrite is a matter of experience and judgment, not really a matter of scientific analysis.
Back to that point about connoisseurship, I think.
Definitely. I think that was it. We had a mutual, I think he was a good friend of yours. I knew him through the antiques business, but Gerard Hawthorne.
Yes, I knew him very well.
Yes, and I remember talking to him. Yes, and I remember talking to him about that in his gallery, about how could you actually tell that a jade snuff bottle was of a particular age, and in the end, it was just that. It was just that lifetime of study. I think that was it.
I was at a lecture of the Oriental Ceramic Society of Hong Kong nearly 40 years ago, just after it was founded. And we had a talk addressed by somebody who was very famous then, called Soame Jennings, who was actually working at the British Museum. And he had been a Hong Kong government civil servant, actually, in the late 20s. But he gave this talk about ceramics. And somebody in the audience asked him, but Mr. Jennings, how do you know it's genuine? He was an enormous man wearing a double-breasted suit. He stood up. He pulled himself into his full height and he said, connoisseurship, madam.
That's it.
Silence in the room.
Well, then let's turn to the institutions. Florian, how does your museum, if it's acquiring something, how do you decide if it's authentic?
Yeah, so I think connoisseurship still matters.
Yeah.
Of course, now we have scientific methods of finding out. So I think, I was thinking about what both of you said, that with provenance and authenticity, that's one way of using the ownership history and the archival documentation to come to a conclusion, right? But with scientific analysis, of course, we have many more ways of finding out these days. So I think where the two come together, it makes a lot of sense. And specifically, I think in museums where collections are questionable and where museum colleagues need to go back in time to look at objects that came back, as we earlier said, under different circumstances.
Good. I follow on LinkedIn. There's a very famous art authentication expert. I won't name him, but I love following him because he is very dismissive of the scientific methods of checking up on art. He says it purely is a question of connoisseurship, because he says that if he wants to, he can fake any of these things that you scientifically test. And Toby, you sort of touched on that. Do you want to tell your story about the issue of the shards of porcelain being put into items?
Yeah, I mean, it's in this part of the world. I mean, I will, if you allow me to read out a short quote from talking about Hong Kong's vulnerability to counterfeiters. In developing countries, labor cost is low, and this affects counterfeiters. Hong Kong, with full employment, does not by itself provide the low-cost labor, but its proximity to a vast and low-cost labor market in the PRC and its position as an entrepot and its efficient communications make it a useful base for counterfeiters. Now, that was said by the former Hong Kong Deputy Judge Anthony Neo back in 1991. And I think since then, we've seen proliferation of fakes that are coming from China. Not least, you have a painting factory market just over the border in Dafen. But if we go back to Jingdezhen, which you were talking about, and the shards, then yes, I mean, a way of quick fooling, if I can put it that way. I mean, it doesn't stand up to more tests, but if you have a pottery piece, now if you're the owner and you want to get it dated, there's a very simple method called thermoluminescence testing, which is basically, to put it simply, it measures the time that that's the sample you take from that piece that since the clay was last fired. So, of course, if you're taking a very expensive piece to get tested, and it costs about, $500 US or so to do a basic test here in Hong Kong, then where will they take the sample from? They're not going to drill on the outside of the piece where obviously it will show, because it's a very destructive test. It uses almost like a dentist drill to get the sample out. So they'll tend to look inside or at the base. Now, obviously, fakers they know that that's where the samples will come from. So, of course, when they're making these things, they will have old shards from the old imperial kilns, and they will put them into that manufacture. And to a simple test of taking that sample will show that it is plus or minus the 30% hit rate that you have. It will show that possibly that clay sample could be, say, the Tang Dynasty horse that you think you're looking at, but it doesn't, of course, show that that is a Tang Dynasty horse.
I bought some fake song bowls with that intention.
I did it as well. I mean, I did a survey myself. I conducted a survey amongst the many galleries in Hollywood Road on the issues of due diligence and on this sort of testing analysis. I went in there like the average tourist that wants to take something back from their travels, and I ended up buying what I knew at the time of buying was a very expensive fake. But I did it so that I could then take it to be tested and drilled where you would never drill it. So I've got 2 holes in this lovely caparison saddled Tang Dynasty-esque horse. I've got one big hole on its head and one big hole on its butt. And I must be the only person who, when I got my certificate of authenticity back from the official labs in Oxford, and there it was. It showed me that this piece was very, very modern and not a Tang Dynasty horse whatsoever. But on the back of that, I mean, I just did, as I said, these questionnaires, surveys, and the whole issue of self-regulation and due diligence within the market. I would say I was not surprised to learn the findings that I got. There are, let me put a caveat there, that of course, there are some very, very good, honest dealers. It's the same with any market, of course. But would I buy something without any of the knowledge that I have. It's like, it's like going to the races. If you're prepared to lose $500 and that's fine, that's great. Buy it because you like it. And unless you've got an expert to take along with you, that those are the dangers going into that market. But I mean, I have done my own little sort of research on this subject.
Well, and you are a connoisseur. You knew that horse was wrong.
I did at the time. Well, I guessed it was. I mean, there were some things that weren't quite right with it, but anyway, I was as I said, very pleased to get my certificate of guarantee, which was spelt with a Y and not double E. So I mean, these are a few of the other things that you can look at.
I think that was a clue. Yes, but again, your story is great because I think again, a lot of us get fascinated by fakes, and of course, there are people who collect fakes. There are even museums of fakes in the world as well. And as we said earlier, some of those famous fakers, now their works are highly collectible, including your fake painting as well, or your real painting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if while we're talking whether Jay can put up those slides because we're on the subject of fakes.
I don't know if we've got them ready yet, so we're probably getting ready for the second panel. I'm just thinking we'll get those and we'll get those put up as well.
I just want to add to that. I'm not maybe a little bit away from the fake discussion, but in our collection we have a small group of Korean Celadon ceramics that I'm quite sure came to the museum as Chinese. So they are genuine, but not Chinese. And for us, we included them in an exhibition talking about the regional and international influence of Chinese ceramic making. And so they are tremendously important to our collection, if you like. But a museum that set out to collect Chinese art, I think probably collected these. This goes back several decades as Chinese pieces. And you could say if there would have been more maybe connoisseurship or more provenance research, that we would have known back in the day that they are possibly not Chinese.
But does that also build into that we're always learning new things about these items as well?
Absolutely.
Would it have been, it probably wasn't apparent at the time. There may have been a misattribution of those items at that point anyway.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
I will.
Interesting research objects.
Yes, Sarah mentioned the idea that there are many museums probably in the world who have things that are authentic. I have been assured by one very well-known local archaeologist that there are a few museums in Hong Kong. Wasn't going to touch on. Yeah, well, it wasn't not Florian's museum, but another museum was mentioned in Hong Kong where there may be some issues with some items there or whatever else.
Some research at one of them around these shipwreck objects, and this is another kind of challenge about the legality versus the ethics. I think Steve earlier in the introduction touched on Michael Hatcher, and there's a significant number of objects from Michael Hatcher and Michael Flecker, if you're watching, who also did some of the work on Balaton and other ships. And apologies to my friends at the Maritime Museum, but in the Maritime Museum, and that I think it opens up a bigger question around what do we do now, which is what Florian's touched on, and that we can't judge the past by today's standards, but we can respond to it. So given that this is already in a museum, the International Congress of Maritime Museums has a code of ethics which says it shouldn't be displayed, it shouldn't be in the collection, and there's various kind of caveats on why you would display that. But what do we do with that? The significant pieces of art, the significant Chinese cultural heritage objects. Do we put them in the store, which Angus as a collector has already said, well, this is not what you want to happen with your objects, but that provides a source for archaeologists and researchers to access stores. So I don't think if they're off display, that's kind of lost.
No.
But my solution to that, and this is controversial within the archaeology community, is you do research that, you make the most of that, and you try to give that context to the museum. It's raised some questions about, how it came to be in the museum. It's raised questions about provenance because some of them aren't what we think they are, even though they have come from treasure hunted collections via, Christie's. Apologies if anyone's in the room.
You're using more and more online.
Way. But I think we have to be also pragmatic, right? In that these are in these collections. If they are there and they were taken unethically or illegally, then there should be questions of repatriation. And the National Gallery of Australia, you've spoken about its Asian Art Provenance Project, has returned not only objects to India, something that it paid $5 million for back in the day, but also Cambodia. But for objects that maybe can't be returned or haven't been returned, or there's no consideration of that, what do you do with those? And I think research and potentially interpreting within the museum, along with the objects, questions about their origin, the provenance research, how they've come to be there, so that you're opening up a conversation, not that this shouldn't be there because it was treasure hunted and certain bodies think that's unethical, but it is here. Now let's be open and use that as a basis of a kind of public discussion and education process.
So there you're talking about the display of items where perhaps, there's a question mark about the provenance. So what about selling shipwrecked china in your shop as a museum? Yes. So we'll leave that one for the moment.
Steve,
I don't know.
a very pointed remark again around a shop of that is attached to a museum that's not Florian's in Hong Kong, that for many years was selling the same objects in its museum shop that it was displaying in the museum, and it had belonged to one of the professional bodies that said that this is absolutely unethical and shouldn't occur. So you've signed up to the code of ethics of your professional body, you're displaying treasure hunted material. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, treasure hunted is, from an archaeological point of view, the excavation or removal of material that hasn't been done scientifically and within the requirements of archaeology.
Can we say irregular?
Irregular? Yeah.
Irregular.
Yeah, because sometimes it's not illegal. If you go back to Balatung, it wasn't illegal to do that, to excavate that shipwreck in Indonesia. And many countries were doing deals with treasure hunters saying, well, we don't have the resources to excavate that archaeologically. If you go and, dig it up, you take 70% and sell that and fund your recovery. I won't say excavation because that suggests it's archaeological. And then we'll take a representative sample for our museum.
Mm-hmm.
But this is now one of the challenges, is that's considered totally inappropriate, even though it wasn't illegal at the time and it was state sanctioned. But the selling, this is, again, archaeologically, we have a very different set of standards and responses to that than museums. The question for me is where you've got archaeologists in museums, and the museum fraternity has, I think, standards and codes for when you deaccession. But again, archaeologists say you can't sell that, but a museum might be selling an archaeological object which is perfectly acceptable within the museum community's kind of standards. I don't know if I've answered that question or raised more questions than
we raised the issue of selling these things. I think myself, I was a little bit disappointed. I thought we criticised that museum for actually putting these things in their shop before, and I hope they would put them on sale, and then I could buy them cheaply. So I was thinking it was
to get in before they were taken off sale. They've been taken off sale.
Oh, okay. They were quite nice. I quite liked them. You see, that was the thing.
Yeah, I found it interesting when I was researching in the museum store and finding objects that actually we had photos of that they'd been on sale like the year before. And so this is, I could be criticised professionally from other archaeologists for engaging with treasure hunted material because it's against the ethics of and the requirements of certain maritime archaeological bodies too. And somebody in the UK was really, really professionally damaged by working. This is many, many years ago. There was a treasure hunted collection, or sorry, let me reframe that. There was a Dutch VOC ship that the Dutch government had engaged salvors to recover I think it was gold or silver bars, like literal treasure, as you would imagine as a kid, on this shipwreck because the Dutch Treasury wanted the money back. The Dutch culture ministry didn't know anything about it because they're quite low down in the hierarchy of ministries in the Netherlands. And an archaeologist and her team asked the salvor if they could go on board and try to recover as much archaeological information as possible during this kind of financial salvage. And she was disparaged is a kind word. She was threatened with having her archaeological license for another very famous shipwreck withdrawn from her. She was threatened to be removed from the professional bodies. Like there was this huge uproar. And knowing her, I knew that it was genuine. Like this is going to happen anyway. Let's make the best intervention we can to get the most knowledge we can from this site for the betterment of humanity and what we know about what happened at that time. And she nearly lost her career over it. And actually 20 years later, in many situations, it's still held against her.
It's still being talked about. We're still talking about it. The sort of issues are coming up.
That because I think like Toby knows the artist or the policeman who arrested the artist. I think this is a really unique situation about what was legal and what was ethical and the hierarchies within the politics of kind of heritage.
Okay, well, we're going to revisit some of these matters that we've already raised in the other panels, but maybe we've only got a few minutes left for this panel, but we can just touch on that sort of idea of changing attitudes, again, for the acquisition of items by museums, and it then feeds into what they do and private collectors as well. Probably one of the biggest changes in the last 30 odd years has been restrictions on the trade in endangered species. I mean, CITES has been around for a lot longer, but definitely the implementation and the enforcement of CITES and then the changes in Hong Kong very recently. I don't know, from an institutional viewpoint, Florian, do you have much ivory or rhinoceros horn or anything?
Not so much in our collection. I think, again, other museums may be more impacted. But then the question is also how far back do you go, right? So if you can send across borders ivory that is more than 100 years old, but not younger than that, then that's, again, another cutoff date that may help or not help certain museum collections.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it depends on the particular jurisdiction because the laws aren't uniform anyway. Yeah. They're so complex, they're so difficult to understand. I don't know if I'll pass on to Angus to talk, but I know that when I was a dealer, when you could buy and sell ivory, it is a wonderful substance, and there are wonderful artworks that have been made out of ivory, hundreds of years old, not so old as well. In England, when they were changing the laws and trying to bring in laws to do with a cutoff date of around about 1925, I think they were talking about, that led to a whole issue with the chryso-elephantine bronzes, the famous sort of Art Deco bronzes or whatever else of Ferdinand Priest and others. The fact that these things would then be subject to some form of ban, that they couldn't be sold. And then there became the question of, what do you do with them then?
And I experienced that. So maybe 8-9 years ago, we were offered 3 pieces of ivory that probably date to the 1960s, 1970s, Hong Kong ivory carving, I assume, and we didn't accept them.
And in case Hong Kong and this southern China area, some of the most beautiful ivory carvings ever made. Yeah. This area was famous for it. Angus, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I think the concern with ivory is very, very valuable and very important. We have to protect elephants. Elephants are being slaughtered all over Africa for their ivory, which is then exported to China allegedly. I think the traffic is now much smaller than it was, and I hope that's true. And having said that, China has a tremendous tradition of working ivory, beginning in the Ming Dynasty and coming up certainly to the middle of the 19th century. Very, very accomplished carvers were working, principally in Guangzhou, working ivory, and they produced wonderful things. Now, those wonderful things can't be just banned because they're made of ivory. No, 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 no. There has to be a sort of connoisseurship test, which is what we're now back to talking about. Authenticity and connoisseurship. When was it made? When do you think it was made? When should it not have been after a particular date? That's where you come to connoisseurship. And that's become very important in terms of identifying ivory as a product which can continue to be sold legally or not.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our first panel. So if you join me in saying thank you to our panelists for the first panel. Thank you very much. The second panel we'll undertake. I'll give you a little introduction to the second panel very shortly. But of course, in the first panel, we just suffered a minor technical hitch during the break, which is why we're a little bit late coming back. But of course, we'd had a major technical issue earlier because I failed to put up Toby's slides where he was going to talk to us about an interesting recovery to do with fake Chinese treasures. So we've now got the PowerPoint ready.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So on the subject of fakes, obviously, and then that preceding slide, which obviously a lot of the reason that those items are in that museum in Taiwan is obviously due to the historical fleeing of the Kuomintang and taking items to their new palace museum. So what I want to talk to you about is about a case that happened in Hong Kong in 2011, and there's a lot of story behind what you'll see, and a lot of it is to do with creating a false provenance, and specifically around the idea that a crate sort of fell off the back of the wagon, as we say, and was now recently discovered full of treasures that were from the original palace museum, well, from the Forbidden Palace, and then were on its way to Taiwan. So, so yeah, if you just hit the next slide, here you can see items. These items were recovered from a 20-foot shipping container that was on a river trade barge loaded from Huangpu in the Pearl River Delta on their way to Taiwan. And they stopped off at the river trade terminal in Tuen Mun. And if had not been the story later, they would have gone on to Taiwan, and they would have had an export certificate from Hong Kong, which would help in having some trail type of provenance, if you like. But as you can see from this picture, and particularly on the right-hand side, the various boxes that these items were found in, and there were hundreds and hundreds of crates. And I later you'll see the shipping container, but when they were laid out, it was in a warehouse, and they just went on forever. Anyway, I looked at many of these pieces, and the crates in particular on the right-hand side were really interesting because these were aged to look, and with certain writings on them and stamps and labels to give this impression that these items were dated back to 1949 and the packing of said items. But actually, when you got to see them, they were, if you buy a souvenir type pottery from any shop, they'll give you that kind of gift box, if you know what I mean. And these were above that quality, but really they were not much to them. And if you go to the next slide, Steve, this is actually what a box that housed a treasure that went from Beijing to Taiwan. These items that we're talking about were revered. And so the items, how they would travel from one place to another, were equally works of art, if you ask me. And this was taken, I took this picture from a friend of mine who is a very, very reputable dealer in Hong Kong. And he was selling this as an antique. And quite rightly so, and fully provenanced, I should say. But the point is that this is what you would expect to see these items housed in. Next slide, Steve, please. As Steve mentioned in the first panel, this just gives you a sort of idea of the sort of demand to order scale of these fakes that are coming through. Again, they will see things that have sold in the catalogs and they will reproduce them, and to a not bad standard, as I said, but not past the very experienced collector or that scrutiny that we expect on our due diligence checks. The next slide shows you the actual container. So this was listed, the manifest was Tupperware and plastics, and it was just by chance that it got picked up in an inspection, because I think customs are on record as saying that only 1% of cargo actually can really be checked. So you think about how many containers are out there with all sorts of things that aren't what their manifest says they are. So you can see the sort of scale of when these boxes, and inside there were not just ceramics, there were scrolls, there was jade, there was stonework, there was wooden material. It just went on forever, and I was just staggered at the amount. So again, the next slide shows you again some scrolls, and again the next one too, Steve, is fine. Just to show that I just picked a few that sort of show the breadth of what was inside. And interestingly enough, the next slide which was part of the sort of official documents that came with these items. You might pick out one glaring point, and I don't read Chinese characters, but I believe these are simplified characters. Is that correct? Right. So the simplified Chinese came in the 1950s, right? So these items were all stamped and purportedly from 1949. So there is that historical anomaly that throws up, a bit like the Hitler diaries. I don't know if you're familiar with those. Again, the experts were too pleased to have this chance to discover something new. And at the end of the day, the paper that the diaries were written on, they fluoresced, which means that they were modern paper, aged to look old. In the same way, this does not obviously add up. And then the next slide shows you an original Qianlong vase that was sold at just before this container was seized. I think this went for 32 million US, and there is the pleased owner, but she won't be pleased to know that there were about 3 of those inside the crate. I think the point I want to make really is that if this container had not been stock checked, these items, one way or another, would have entered the market, and the scale of this just points obviously to a very organized setup. This is, we've got to go back to the basics, which is, there are criminals are involved in this. It's not a story of lovable rogues trying to outfool the art market. This is it's a business. It's a criminal enterprise. And this case is really, really unique because there hasn't been anything like that seen, which can categorically prove. I mean, I have stories, obviously, of individual pieces that I, know are fake and have had tested, etc., etc. But these on the scale, and the fact that they had this really interesting sort of provenance background, which obviously didn't stand up, but the fact is, someone would believe it. There are people out there that would want to believe that they have got the latest, best deal, that's a secret one at that. And, that's how these things are.
But this lady believes that one's real. Is that real? How much?
Of course it is. Yeah.
32 million US dollars.
Worth of real. Yeah.
Hopefully. Anyway, thank you, Jay. I think we need to change slides. Thank you. So thank you very much, Toby. Yeah, it was definitely worth looking at those slides. What happened to that cargo, by the way, in the end?
Much to my disappointment, I kind of wanted it to be in the Museum of Fakes, but it was destroyed. A bit like you see ivory getting destroyed. I did speak to the head of the Harbour Customs and tried to say, there is a learning opportunity for these pieces, but they were very keen to eradicate them and not have any sort of wouldn't say record of it, but they just didn't see the sort of the academic benefit of having these pieces still in existence. They were fake and to be destroyed. A bit like France. I mean, if France, the law there, if pieces found to be fake, they have the right to destroy it, don't they?
Yes, definitely for some of their artists, don't they? I know that when they have their experts who check up on some of these particular centers, they accept them on the condition that if they decide that it is a fake, that they will be destroyed, because they don't want the fakes in the market. But I quite agree with you. I think it would have been great to have in Hong Kong a museum of fakes.
Yeah, I mean, we're an arts hub. Let's have every aspect of art. I mean, Forbes magazine have put out in the past a statistic that 80% of all Chinese art is fake. That's in print. That's quite staggering. And then there's an art analytics company, Artron, and they talk about global art fake. They've put a figure around 50%. I mean, this is not me deciding those numbers. That's been published. I don't know if that's for the clickability to be able to then, read into those articles, but quite staggering if you think about that.
But definitely a museum of fakes would be a good thing, I think. I don't know, Florian, have you thought about this?
Until it de-accessions.
And then they sold off as real things, with the provenance. Well, anyway, thank you very much. We're moving to the second panel, and I realise we need to move relatively quickly through. I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'll hand over to Angus, who's going to talk to us a little bit about jades and about collecting, and give us a presentation on that. The second panel is on maintaining collections, both for, of course, institutions and private collectors. Security and responsibility was the title we put in there because, of course, I can get this to... Sure it is. There we go. We'll go back one. Yes. So museums have had problems in recent years. So this was the photograph of the Louvre and, of course, the famous jewel theft last year at the Louvre Museum. When this actually happened, of course, my favorite point about this, I know it's not good for museums to get, to have robberies, but was the fact that apparently the crane that you can see there, or the ladder, is made by a German company. And they then used this photograph in their publicity to say how good
I enjoyed reading about it.
I thought that was an excellent piece of whoever is the advertising guy. That is,
and car manufacturing is suffering, so I think that's a good.
It's a good idea. This is if you need a ladder to rob a museum, German ladders are the best in the world. I'm afraid that's got to be it. So at the time, of course, the story, we discuss it with our students. I don't know if you discuss with yours this thing. I always say everyone has this idea that these sort of thefts from museums involve people bypassing alarm systems, using laser beams and everything else. And of course, they don't. They just walk in, smash a cabinet and climb down a ladder and get out. So often quite opportunist sort of thefts as well. It brings us in, of course, the most famous item in the Louvre is, of course, the Mona Lisa. And of course, I think many people know that the only reason this painting is famous is because it was stolen. It was generally considered to be not a great painting before it was actually stolen in 1911. And then the theft of it, the fact that the Louvre left the space and people came to see where the Mona Lisa had been at the time sort of generated a whole story. And of course, then the story of the Italian gentleman who had stolen the painting and then came up with a story about he wanted to repatriate it to Italy, and everything else has led to lots of misconceptions about this particular painting. But museums, security, it's got to be a major concern. The Drents Museum, of course, last year as well had all those gold items stolen from them as well. Moving into other sort of nearer to us sort of issues as well, we get the issue of loans, museum loans, which is a very important part of museums. Museums loan collections, they borrow collections. It's very important in that sort of exchange of these beautiful items, and of course the educational side of museums as well. But of course we have issues, and it comes into not just the security to stop things being stolen, but also being damaged. So you may remember back in 2018 that some of the terracotta warriors had been on a sort of world tour, and they ended up going to a museum in America, the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, where they were put on display. And sometime in the January of 2018, someone noticed that one of the terracotta warriors, its thumb was missing. And of course, that became an international incident. The FBI were called in. They reviewed all the CCTV footage, and they discovered that actually the thumb had been taken sometime in December. So that became part of the scandal as well, that no one had noticed for nearly 2 months that this figure had been damaged. And of course, when they reviewed the footage, they discovered that it'd been a group of young men who had been at an ugly sweater party, which was organized in the Christmas period for this particular institute. They had wandered away from the main party. The warriors hadn't been locked away. The galleries where they were, the doors hadn't been locked, so they just wandered in. And then they'd proceeded to start taking selfies. We'll come on to selfies a little bit later on. Selfies with the figures. And then one is seen to sort of grab the finger of one of them, wrench quickly, and then put something in his pocket. Of course, the FBI quickly trace who this is, and they turn up at his house. And, the story was in the newspapers that he opened the door and said, "I think I know what you're looking for." Opened a drawer and pulled the thumb out and handed it over. I actually met the prosecutor in Italy. There's an art crime research institute in Italy, and I was there last summer, and the prosecutor was there as well. And I got talking to her, and she was explaining actually what happened. The story that the press gave, there's the thing that his lawyer said there. He was charged with grand theft, which meant that the item had to be over a certain valuation. And again, his lawyer did the correct thing, portrayed him as just a silly kid. He'd got drunk, he'd done something that he shouldn't have done. But really, he was arguing that perhaps a criminal damage charge would have been more appropriate. Perhaps his client would have pled to that or whatever. But no, the prosecutors prosecuted him for grand theft. And in America, very serious. We end up with a jury considering this, where, of course, his lawyers then start arguing about the valuation. Because for grand theft, there had to be over a certain amount of dollar value. And of course, his lawyers asked the question, how much is one of these terracotta warriors worth? And unfortunately, the prosecution fell into the trap of saying $2-3 million. And so, of course, then the defense say, "I'd like to buy one." And of course, then the answer was, "Well, you can't buy one." And they said, "Well, how can it be worth $2 or $3 million then? It's valueless." And that was part of the argument that led to initially the jury not coming up with a decision, not being able to come up with a decision. Later on, he pleads guilty to a more minor offence. And I think that was really a political thing that someone had to be called to account for this. But it does raise the issue of loans. My own thoughts would be with the museum officials in America and probably in China who were all involved in this, who probably would have been asked questions about why was security so lax, all of those sorts of things. There would have been lots of question marks around that, and future loans. It's not just, by the way, for museums that these are issues. For private galleries and others and private collectors, of course, the issues of theft and damage is an issue. Again, you may remember this story in 2014 where a gallery was offering things that were for sale as well, and had some of Ai Weiwei's artworks on sale, and some for display as well. A gentleman walked into one of these galleries, picked up one of Ai Weiwei's vases and just dropped it on the floor. So at the time, again, various things he said. He said he was an artist and he was just replicating what Ai Weiwei had done. If you look at the photographs behind there, you may know that there's a famous artwork that Ai Weiwei did, a series of photographs where he drops a Han Dynasty vase. And he said, well, I'm doing the same. Ai Weiwei wasn't impressed, by the way. He said, smashing $1 million vase in the name of art is justified if you own the piece. So maybe we can talk about that again when we come on later to, as a private owner, should you be allowed to destroy art if you want to as well? My favorite story to do with museums, though, and damage to artworks is this one. A German museum was displaying this particular artwork by a German artist, which is a large crossword puzzle, but an unfinished crossword puzzle. The museum was offering a special deal for mature people to visit. I now use the word mature as I've got older. So mature people to visit. And the story was that one lady walked in and she proceeded to pull out a pen and start filling in the crossword. The museum called the police and said this was, criminal damage. The artist, by the way, when he heard about it, said, that's wonderful. That's great. That's part of the art. That's amazing.
She was 91.
91.
It's impressive.
Well, I'm not sure whether she got the answers correct or not. But again, this issue. And again, famous stories about artworks being destroyed and private owners. This is Graham Sutherland's portrait, or at least a representation of Graham Sutherland's famous portrait of Winston Churchill, which was given to Churchill by a grateful nation on one of his birthdays. And the story is he hated it. He hated the portrait. And immediately after he was given it, it went down into the basement of his house. And he left instructions. And after his death, his widow took it out to the garden and burnt it. As he said, it made me look half-witted, which I ain't. A typical sort of Churchill statement. Mm-hmm. So again, afterwards, people said he shouldn't have been allowed to do this. They shouldn't have done this. But of course, it was their painting. It may have been a gift from a nation, but it was their painting. And if you want to talk about destruction of artworks, probably this is one of the most famous public destructions of artworks, isn't it? If you're a fan of Banksy, which actually I am, I quite like Banksy's works, but this is one of those moments when our former dean, Professor Christopher Gain, when this happened, and we were talking at the time, I just started the art law courses at CUHK, and Chris was very supportive of this, and he said, you've got to talk about this case. As a criminal lawyer, I think this is criminal damage. And he said, what you've got to remember is the hammer had gone down. And he's quite right. When the hammer goes down, auction law, a specialized form of contract law, at that point, risk passes to the purchaser. Mm. So in a way, that was the purchaser's property. So when whoever it was, probably Banksy with something in his pocket, makes the painting, to everyone's feigned surprise in the auction room, sort of move down, he is destroying someone else's property at that point. When I asked my students, do you think, if you couldn't get a criminal prosecution, would you go for a civil claim? The big problem is, I think at the time, the painting sold for £1 million. And usually if you're going to sue someone for damaging your property, that's because it's then worth less. But of course, a few years later, it sold for nearly £20 million, wasn't it? So you can't really complain in many ways about any damage to your property and that sort of thing. Again, we started to touch on this with the authenticity. I think this is something we should talk about. Do we need originals in museums? With my students, I usually raise this thing. Dulwich College Picture Gallery in London, which is a wonderful picture gallery, which I recommend you all visit when you go to London. The oldest public picture gallery in the world conducted this experiment where they actually had one of their artworks copied by artists. I think it was in Dauphin in Shenzhen. They paid, I think, about $700, $800 for a copy of one of them, put it into this not so good frame on the right there, and then displayed it. They took the real one off display, put it on display, and challenged people, come and spot the fake. And surprisingly, about 10 to 15% of the people who took part did spot the fake, which I think is quite a high number. But afterwards, when you display the two together, I think you'd probably say, oh, yes, it's obvious. Possibly because I've got the word fake across it there as well, just to remind myself which one it is. But there we go. Other problems we may want to talk to about maintaining collections. This is the problem. You go to see artworks in museums, you can't get near them, particularly because no one's going to admire them anymore. They're just taking photographs of them, aren't they? So we all are at the back of the queue. And again, that issue to do with selfies, there have been a number of incidents. This was a Russian gallery where a lady apparently was taking a selfie, backed up and knocked one of these sort of frames over, which damaged 2 paintings, including a Salvador Dali and a Goya. So maybe we should talk about that. I don't know, Florian, do you allow selfies in your museum?
Yes, but
So
I
far.
think here the museums are rarely so crowded that it's a problem.
That's it.
So it depends.
Okay. And then the final one I thought I should just put in. Again, I don't know if anyone remembers this story. Museums have to be very careful now. We talked earlier about the issues of receiving things from donors where reputations change, having collections where attitudes to things change. We mentioned ivory and rhinoceros horn and other things as well. But also you have to be sensitive about social changes as well. So this is the Court Art Institute in London. In their gift shop, they were issuing these erasers, which were to do with Van Gogh, of course. And they had complaints from people saying this was offensive to people with mental health issues. So I think I'll leave that one here. And sorry, I'll move on. Jay, can we put Angus's slides up, and I'll let Angus take over and talk to us about collecting.
One of the beauties of jade is that it's very difficult to forge. You can reproduce from the natural pebbles, but the work which you do it with is usually with mechanical means today, which are not available to the Neolithic jade worker and in subsequent centuries. So we see the raw material. Happened.
Jay's just trying to. There we go.
Oh. The raw material is, in fact, in the pebbles. And these are pebbles which are borne by the White Jade River down from the Kunlun Mountains in Tibet, down to the Taklamakan Desert in Khotan, in what is now in Xinjiang. So this is a very, very hard material. It's impossible to carve it because, as I explained earlier, it has a felted structure. There are no planes of cleavage. So in order to work it, you've got to rub it. And you've got to rub it with a harder material. And that's a very, very time-consuming, very long, painstaking process.
Go to your notes.
No, I can't read it.
It's too small.
I've got a
Don't
printout
read.
of it here, so hopefully not. This is one.
Have it here with the same cup.
You're quite right. It's this one.
Oh, that's better. Full size.
Okay, I can read my own slides here. So, according to legend, going back to that slide, actually, the earlier one. According to legend, when gathered concentrations of jade pebbles were discovered in the moonlight along the rivers, naked virgins would dive to collect it, or, alternatively, feel their way across the river with their feet and toes encountering the smooth jade pebbles for gathering. This fable demonstrates the natural power and force of yin as the divining gift and power of women, who are the human embodiment of natural force.
Here.
From the earliest times in the period of the Hongsan culture in about 5000 BC, jades were buried in intimate contact with the bodies of the senior and wealthier dead members of society. The exact purpose of doing this is not clear, but the indications are that it was that the benign guiding intention was to provide the axiomatic all-purpose talisman as a minimal but real support for a journey to another place, to accompany the deceased of high status as being able to bear this highly valuable material to succor and sustain his or her journey into and through the unknown world and ethers of the cosmos. Uses of particular jades were written down in the rites of Zhou and the Shijing. These uses were attributed to sacrifices to specific natural forces. Jade quality was the principal attribute of a gentleman. This sense was further taken up by the sage Confucius in Li Zi. Confucius recognized 5 virtues in nephrite of charity, modesty, courage, justice, and wisdom, a perception which over 2,500 years up to now has been a great influence imbued into the Chinese people and has sustained their deep respect for jade. This is a chart of the areas of Neolithic culture. It's rather hard to, if I do the pointer.
And it's
Can
going to be
anybody-
so far away.
No, it's too far away.
You're too far. You might be able to see it there.
Oh, yeah. So the Hongshan culture area is this one in the Liaoning, and then we come down to the Liangzhu culture, a very famous Liangzhu culture in eastern China, and then we have the Neolithic periods in the Shaanxing culture in this area here. Nature provided the basic original form of the raw jade material for man to work into his own image, initially with his face. These raw materials were nephrite pebbles of natural rounded form, of which this is an example. These are generally quite large in size, but regardless of this density and weight, they are all drilled with the essential and unavoidable qualities of enormous skill, tenacity, and dogged perseverance. The work continued on the reverse side or face. So we move on to, next slide. At the top there, you can see the drilling here. You see the holes are drilled here to join up together underneath a sort of bridge here with Florian. So this is another example where there's a front view. The remnant ridging is left by the drilling process, which formed 2 twin loop connected holes. In the second example, the basic contours of the face have large angled eyes set each side of an inverted triangular nose and thin slit mouth. This would be before the Hongshan period from about 5000 BC. Here's this, and let me move on now. Next slide. A slightly later nephrite example, showing a reduced surface of a simple face with a horizontal elliptical eyes above a large triangular nose with a thin and pert slit mouth beneath and a swag of hair on each side. And then the following one, next slide, please. A softly worked female face with horizontal elliptical eyes and a flattened inverted triangular nose above a fuller mouth with a swag of long hair falling down each side. Hongshan period. Yeah, and then the bottom of that, you see the reverse side where there is no central ridge now, and there's 2 linked holes forming a twin drilled connecting loop. At its most, there's the next slide, please. At its most basic, the sawing out of a large and thick slice of nephrite created a massively formed human face, mask in a convex full-face study. These eyes are formed in separate depressions as pierced pits of round boring. They are set separately at each side of and centered inside a carefully raised line, which stands proud from the surface. This line continues to extend and curve gently down from each brow to the center, forming an elegant nose, which is set above the open mouth, showing a horizontal profile of well-formed teeth. Next slide, please. So we have constraints of the human figure working of jade. We were in naturally formed pebbles, and then man began to be able to, with a softer material, form, next slide, please, the human figure, where obviously the female figure was considered to be the guide to measure humanity's achievements. And here is the deceptively smooth roundness and maturity of form, acknowledging the motherhood of man found in this buxom standing figure. The head is comfortably cushioned into the shoulders without a neck. The bulging hips and the arms form a continuous circular motion, which is moving from the shoulders down and around on each side, forming a hole at each shoulder, and meeting with the hands together on the chest. The feet are unimportantly ignored to the point of rounded stumps. Next slide, please. Here is a rather romantic figure of soft material, slightly softer than nephrite, but it's an embracing male and female couple of particular significance, again showing the surface reduction of a harder material to form the subject matter. Next slide, please. Then we come on to the surface reduction of a large block of material. So here we have the front view, and you can see there is a vertical block of material. The face is formed in exactly the same way, with indented eyes, a triangular nose, and a small pert mouth. And the arms are now folded across the chest, utilizing the form of the part of the pebble, and that descends down to the hips, which are rounded and terminate without feet. Next slide, please. Another example, this is rather hard to see in this slide, but on the right and the left-hand side is a female figure, female because it's endowed with certain female organs, and the right-hand side is the reverse side of that figure. But this is basically the working with a very hard material, harder than nephrite, of reduction, surface reduction. Then we come to next slide, please. A somewhat more sophisticated form, but again, a natural pebble is used. There is a fearsome humanoid type of figure with surface cross-hatching. The back side, which we see on the right-hand side, is of folded wings and supported by a fan-shaped tail. This is, again, the Hung-san culture about 2500 BC. Next slide, please. Then we come to a vertical piece of nephrite, which had been formed credibly with a human figure standing with hands clasped together across the chest. The apparent suppleness of the lithe and limber proportions of the elegant and shapely thighs would be the envy of a 21st century athlete or fashion model. Next slide, please. Revere the reverse side and then the side view. Next slide, please. Another example showing how the development became still simple, but still more sophisticated. So there is a softness about the way in which this figure is represented. Left side, please. And here we have, at last, a clear demonstration of pregnancy, where there's a lady kneeling. I'm not quite sure why she's kneeling, but that's the way she was formed, and she is pregnant. And this is a naked female figure with swelling breasts and a distended stomach, supported by her arms. She is pierced behind her neck for suspension. Hung-san culture, about 3000 BC. Then, next slide, please. Then, about 2000 BC, Chinese civilization began to use bronze. They learned how to do it, and that greatly simplified the use of the jade worker for working nephrite, because with bronze tools, you could rub away. Instead of rubbing with your fingers, you rub with a bronze tool dipped in a harder material than the nephrite, but makes it much easier to work. So this revolutionary achievement emancipated and released the jade worker from the cumbersome mandate, which up to that time was unavoidably restricted to the simple abrading and limited incising of linear detail, barely breaking through the surface. So the next slide, please. We have here an example of the way in which a groove was made to form a raised form. So each side of to the right and left of each side of the central level, there was a groove formed. So that made a raised line, and that was the beginning of a raised line work in the working of nephrite. Next slide, please. So now we move into the way that human figures began to be represented. So we still have the vertical presentation, but now the legs are more detailed, the feet are more detailed, and the arms are laid across the lap with the hands filled together. Next slide, please. Two more examples. Next slide, please. Here we have the raised line work more clearly demonstrated. So on the left-hand side, we have clear monster face. On the right-hand side, we have a similar piece, but this time the face is human. Next slide, please. Then we move into the clear development of a monster face with additional actual raised lines. This is a pillar form of human face with a short flared upward rising and plain neck or pedestal base surmounted above the face with a vertical terminal with upper and clear vertical grooved lines. Next slide, please. So now we have a vertical figure where the elegance of the shape descending from the very sophisticated and heavily worked head down through the arms across the lap and down into feet, which are very elegant and slender. And on the right-hand side, you see the proper representation of this face, which is still a sort of humanoid or ghoulish type of face, but nonetheless beginning to wear things like earrings and with a mouth showing a very good set of teeth. Next slide, please. A standing male figure of a structured material of three-dimensional figures with carefully worked proportionate head, arms, torso, and limbs. The figure stands with extensions from the body to each side, forming open-work wings, and holds its hands together across its abdomen. A series of three-dimensional, vertically organized navels in high relief separate the two fat and buxom thighs, which descend to the pair of feet standing on a small squared base. This is Shandong Lungsan culture, 1800 BC. Next slide, please. This is the rear view of the same piece. Next slide, please. And then we start going into the plaque form of nephrite working. So this is a monster mask. Each side of the monster mask is a detail of I can't read my own writing. open eyes on the face. And then on the back, on the right-hand side, there are very carefully worked, indented Chinese characters, but characters. Nobody has yet interpreted what these actually mean, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Again, we have, although it's rather hard to see, there is a flat complex plaque. All around is an open-mouthed tiger form rising above collateral forms of standing birds on each side. Next slide, please. And then a flat monster mask with a horizontal strip with a broad and short vertical grooving. The mask has lateral grooves each side of the corner-angled eyes and are themselves set above a prominent nose with a closed lip mouth and tightly clenched teeth, revealing upward and downward fangs. And then on the right-hand side, the slide shows Chinese characters, or just characters, which at the moment are not translatable. Next slide, please. This is rather hard to describe because the picture is not very clear, but at the right-hand, each side of the central B disc, in the center of which there is a human mask. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of the center of that disc, where there is what's called a, not human. Normally we call these humanoid because they're similar to humans. So in the center of the left-hand side is a humanoid head with a big open mouth with tightly clenched teeth, and above another humanoid head. And then on the right-hand side, the slide shows a support of each side of the disc, where standing figures are able to stand each side. Next slide, please. Similar period of back-to-back heads, and below a humanoid mask. Next slide, please. A humanoid mask with earrings, with a clenched teeth, and above the house is a headdress with a human figure standing with widely spread legs. Next slide, please. Another example showing basically above the head is a headdress of a curving, a banana-shaped curve with a double-headed dragon at each side, biting a central wheel. Next slide, please. A similar example where the double head is not biting a wheel, but in between the double head, there is a humanoid head. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So with that show of scholarship, were those all items in your collection?
Yes.
So do you think, as a private collector, you have an obligation to research and then to share your research? Or is this just your passion?
No, I think there is an obligation, of course. I mean, you make a collection, you have to know what you're doing. And in order to know what you're doing, you have to read what other people have done. And you can sift out other people's knowledge, just solidify it, test it into, put it into your own formulation, and then you can do your own writing. Because in fact, moving on, instead of just having a sale catalogue of bits and pieces, you are justifying the creation of justifying human creation. Here I'm talking about Chinese human creation, because jade is an essentially Chinese tradition, and why it was done and where it's going and what are the results.
Good. And so when will your books on the human form be published?
Well, volume 1, which dates from 5000 BC to 1300 BC, the end of the Shang dynasty, is currently about to be printed.
And how many more volumes?
Volume 2, well, and volume 3, 2 more volumes. But they end up with the Liao period, about 1200 AD. And above that is the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty. And I have to regard them as being relatively new and uninteresting.
So Ming and Qing is uninteresting.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. Thank you very much.
In jade carving.
In jade carving, yes, we should say that.
And jade carving.
But
yes.
then,
No.
but then maybe I can move then on to ask Florian about that, because I think for public institutions, for museums, I think everyone would accept that there is an obligation for scholarship. It's part of the being of museums. I think it's always been, and education. It's got to be part of what museums do. So how much can we go the other way now and say that museums should be about entertainment as well?
Well, first, to go back to that, I think, and we actually know this from the International Council of Museums definition of the museum, that the scholarship that museum professionals do and the public education is comparatively recent. I mean, it was added to the definition so that we move away from the keeping, the old English term that is still used in some London museums is keeper,
Yes,
for curator.
Mm.
And that describes maybe what they are doing or what they used to be doing. And so we are moving away from that slowly. And I fully agree with you that it also makes our profession more interesting. With the edutainment, I would put emphasis on the first part of the word, of course, but I can see the value to bring in different audiences to make it more accessible. But I think, and I wanted to remark that when you earlier went to describe the exhibition at the Dalish Gallery, I think it's about communicating the artwork, right? You can have the real and the reproduction next to each other if it's absolutely clear what is what. And that maybe goes back also to your comments about the high percentage of pieces that may not be quite as real as we want them to be. So I think with the edutainment, there is a place for it. If it still confers a value and is educational, I think. Otherwise, I'm not one of the maybe growing museum cohort that thinks that the museum as a platform for fun and entertainment has to become bigger for us to attract different audiences. I think the education part has to be in it, but then I also work for a university museum, as you know. So
yes, a particular type of museum in its own way.
So don't have an ugly sweater award party in a museum.
Well, then that goes in. Toby, maybe you can address this. The Louvre, is it doing enough to look after its treasures from a
The case is ongoing, right?
But from a sort of security side or whatever else, you know.
I think what you can say is look at trends, and there is a trend at the moment on museum thefts where they're looking to take highly portable items, especially ones that have what you could say is a high liquidity value. So in the Louvre, you've got obviously priceless gemstones and metals, and the thieves will not have any care whatsoever to any historical, cultural, or educational purpose behind these items. And you're seeing now in a number of cases, in fact, there was another theft in Paris just the month before in September at the Paris Natural History Museum, where they stole a number of gold items. And the same month down in Limoges, $11 million worth of Chinese artifacts were stolen. Now, if I was a policeman in Paris looking at these items, I would think that possibly they could be linked. What they've got in common is shall we say, you mentioned it earlier about lasers and cutting off access alarms and all the very clever Hollywood-style ways of committing a theft on this scale that gets all the attention. But actually what you're seeing is a trend of brute force and looking at where the weaknesses are. And things like the Louvre really should never have ever happened. I mean, it's just crazy. The museum was open as well, so you'd imagine that there are guards. Were there any alarms on the windows, etc.? Were they if they were they turned off? I mean, there's just so many questions, and of course the case is still ongoing. They made arrests, but they haven't found any of the items, and I think sadly that those items will be, you know, they'll never look the same. They'll either be recut or melted down, and you know, it's too late. Yeah. So it does raise a whole bunch of questions. I think you mentioned also the terracotta thumb, and so there's two things that I'd say on that aspect with regards to one about the museum is that should a museum, and Florian could pick up this, should a museum, I understand, of course, funds are always an issue, and certainly on security, that this is one of the items that have been flagged for the Louvre. You know, they didn't spend enough on their museum security. But should a museum really be renting out its space to hold these sort of other non-museum events? Because this person obviously snuck out of this event for an ugly Christmas sweater party, and found his way in the Terracotta Museum. Now, again, the museum security should have been, you know, completely closed off, etc., etc. But first question is that, and the second point I would say is that the outrage that was caused in China by this terracotta thumb criminal damage or whatever how you want to describe it was incredible. I mean, it really set the internet alive. But what some people don't realize is, of course, that, you know, you could say the sort of what comes around goes around, sort of karma sort of things. This was 2018, that terracotta, but in 2013 there was a case of, in the Luxor temple in Egypt, there were a Chinese young man decided to do a little bit of graffiti in the temple, and he put Ding Jinhao was here. And again, I mean, the Egyptians quite rightly were like, this is desecration of their cultural heritage, and the Egyptians, you know, as a source nation, much like China, was outraged. So but I don't think they can take the whole high horse of, you know, just saying, you know, this was an attack on our culture. It happens everywhere, as I say. But really, that was an aside. I am interested to know on Florian's point of view about, should museums in a way to maybe get more money into the museum, so that they can do the education and the protection and everything else which a museum we love about. Should they have held that sort of event? I mean, you can't talk for that museum, but just I'd be interested in your view.
Yeah, I think it depends on the galleries and the setup that are made available. And I don't know anything about the setup there, but I assume that the space that was given to the party was probably quite secure. And then these gentlemen snuck off and went into a space which is, you could argue, not event related, right? And vandalized, whether they had alcohol or not, an important cultural heritage. So I think I want to say, if it's a controlled environment, there are many advantages, and it's not necessarily generating of extra income. It's also bringing different audiences to the museum. Many at these parties, many of the participants come to the museum, whatever museum, for the first time. So there are many different reasons, from sort of a museum education point of view, if you like, from doing that. None of that justifies any vandalism, obviously. I mean, I want to see them as almost separate cases, because obviously we all agree that we don't want any cultural heritage damaged.
And they did leave the event to go into a different space.
Yes.
And I'm sure at least every event I've been in a museum, it's been quite clear that this is where your event is taking place, and you are not welcome to wander off.
Florian, can we rent space in the Hong Kong U for an ugly sweater party?
If I like the party, no. We've done it we've done it more in connection with corporate sponsorship.
Yeah.
So if somebody sponsored an exhibition, they could have a VIP reception or so, but that is a related event. And of course we had staff members. We always have staff members there to, in some case, guard, and in another way also at times to give information and teach.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes, and
So
Sarah's quite right. I think that the incident there in the Franklin Institute was they hadn't locked off the galleries. Yeah, I think it was as basic as that. They just hadn't locked the galleries, which case allowed people to wander off and go into areas that they shouldn't have been in.
So it could have happened during public opening hours, with or without the sweaters.
Probably. Well, during public times, I take it they would have had docents there, guards or whatever would have been around.
More staff.
Yeah.
That then raises a question of, why is there not appropriate security during an event where alcohol is being served? You know, in many jurisdictions, once you're drunk, you can't give consent. So I think if there's alcohol involved, then it raises a bunch of other questions for me about the suitability of that event and not having appropriate security.
Actually, you're speaking like his defense lawyer. The defense did raise the issue of the alcohol being there and everything, so it was
sent.
But it does that. So two issues that you raised there were actually two issues that so Josh from the CUHK Art Museum was going to be with us, but unfortunately had to go up to on a trip, so he wanted to be here, but he'd mentioned issues to do. Toby, you said this thing about security, the things with the Louvre, obviously is a big cost. You know, the cost of security, and museums have limited budgets.
Yeah, but I mean, so museum thefts, I mean, as long as there's been a museum, there'll have been thefts, right? So, but even ones that you would imagine, okay, the Louvre, most visited museum in the world, you would think that they would be on top of their case. Palace Museum in Beijing, you would think that, especially how, you know, we talked about the reverence to items and how important it is to their cultural history. In 2010, there was, you know, a theft of significant items that, and they had, you know, thousands of security cameras. They had, you know, hundreds of guards. They had even security dogs, but still somebody managed to basically bang a hole in a wall and steal and he was caught, but they haven't recovered all of the items. But even in the Palace Museum, you have this. But again, with thefts in museums, it's interesting because I think there's a statistic somewhere that 85% of the people that are involved in thefts have some connection to that museum, whether it be the actual workers, the security guards, contractors, inside knowledge. So, I mean, it's a general throwaway statistic, but it shows you that generally people don't just decide on the spur of the moment to go and steal something. Although there have been a couple of cases we talked about the British Museum recently in those thefts, but that was, again, possibly, the case hasn't come to court, could be tied to an employee. But in the British Museum before that, there was, I think 2002, there was a Greek statue worth £25,000 that was just stolen during daytime by a member of the public. And again, there was another theft at the British Museum a number of years later. Same thing, just a member of the public, spur of the moment, you would say. So those cases, of course, you'll always have museum theft cases like that. But generally, for those sort of ones that when arrests and they've looked at it, once the case is decided, they look at it, 85% generally is some connection to that. So you go back to your security vetting. Right. So when you hire and you go back to perhaps look at, there was statistics in America where a museum nighttime guard is earning less than a McDonald's worker. So this just screams, right? If you don't
their lives.
Yeah. And quite possibly they could end up, dying to protect the items they're there for. So there just still is that sort of there's a problem there, and it's quite a glaring problem.
And it goes back to funding in many cases. And I think the outgoing director of the Louvre mentioned that there were several requests for additional funding to beef up the security. And again, not to defend anybody there, but I think that's, of course, a common problem also. And if it's an inside job, then all the security in the world isn't going to help.
No.
Right.
Yeah, and yes, determined thieves often do get through anyway, don't they? Even if you have that sort of redundant systems where you have guards at different places or whatever else, that's it.
Now, there are interesting voices saying with AI and technology, there are different ways today to notice uncommon behavior among human beings, museum visitors that typically behave in somewhat the same way. So if somebody stands too long in a vitrine, it could be me, but it could be somebody who is trying to inspect the vitrine rather than its contents and things like that. So there are technologies now, but of course they cost a lot of money too. So it may not be necessarily human fault in the future, but it could also be something where technology exists, doesn't work, or is not there, and so on and so forth.
But again, not just AI, there are a lot of Western museums with their security directors who are training, that staff will undergo training on a ORI method, which stands for observation, recognition of behavior, risk analysis, and intervention. So that mentions, again, what Florian was saying about giving them a little bit of training in sort of body language, psychology, being able to look for any deviant behaviors. And so this is actually giving your security staff you much more buy-in to what their job is, because if they receive training, you feel better in being able to do your job, right? You're not just the lowest quality guy standing by a doorway. You actually are a meaningful part of the museum. So I think it's interesting.
If they are a part of the museum.
If they're part of the
museum. So that's an important point too. So many institutions like universities employ an external company for campus security, right? So we just changed that at our museum, but many museums operate in the same way. They contract a known or unknown security firm to run around on campus.
That sounds a bit riskier. I suppose they think they're professionals, but
Well, there's less belonging, I'd say.
That's all.
Connection.
Yeah.
It raises an interesting question for me about the AI observation, and that we joked before with the Mona Lisa and everyone's taking selfies, that we wanted people to stand and, gone are the days where people would stand and admire. But if you do stand and admire now and don't take a selfie, the AI is going to think you're casing the place.
Absolutely.
It's nice to use that police terminology. But I'll just say that I think we're going to carry on through the tea and coffee break. I think there may be some tea and coffee outside if anyone does want to wander out. But I think because of time, we'll just carry on talking. I did want to bring Angus in there then, because we're talking about institutions and security. What about private collectors? Is security a concern for private collectors?
Where do you live again?
And is your
Hong Kong.
and other goodies at home, or are they in security?
They're not at home.
Good.
They're safe.
But I mean, it must be a cost for a collector as well to worry about these things and everything.
Well, if you're worried about it, yes, I'm not. So no, I don't have a problem with it. But no.
The cost must be substantial if you're keeping it in offsite security for a large collection as a private individual hiring insurance.
No, I don't.
You better not tell us too many details.
I had
Hypothetically.
I had a client as a solicitor in 1973 who was the Hong Kong executive of a Philippine insurance company, and it gave me quite a lot of legal business. And one day I said to him, well, look about insurance. I mean, I'm a collector, so maybe I would like to insure some things in my collection. He said, don't bother. He said, the problem with loss adjusting is you value the piece at $100 million. The loss adjuster comes along and says it's worth $10,000. The insurance company will give you half that, $5,000 for $1 million piece. Don't bother. So I listened to what he said, and I've not bothered ever since.
Not sure if there's anyone from the insurance world here who wants to come back on that or online. But sort of leading on from that, again, Josh, I had a number of conversations with Josh at CUHK Art Museum. He'd raised some issues for museums about the cost of insurance, particularly for loans and bringing things in or whatever else. But the other thing that he did talk, we were talking about a certain artifact that he wanted to put on display. Very valuable, very fragile, but it was quite a large thing. I won't say what it is because the museum may put it on display soon. And it sounded wonderful. And he was describing it. And I said, well, of course, you're going to be worried about damage. Put it in a glass case, won't you? And he said, no, I want it to be accessible to people. I want them to be able to walk around it and admire it and everything else. So, that's another issue, isn't it, for museums? The security side, not just for theft, but damage, but also wanting people to enjoy things and see them. Florian,
I think that's right. I think the three-dimensionality of exhibiting a piece is very important.
Florian, how do you feel about this?
I fully agree with you and with Josh, and I think in a way in Hong Kong we are blessed that the museum visiting public is very civilized, and I hope it stays that way. And we have always thought about how things are displayed, and often went the way that Josh seems to be going with this object, and it worked out fine. Now, I think with insurance, of course, museums insure their collections and incoming loans and outgoing loans and the transit from A to B and back. I think it is absolutely necessary, and it depends on the relationship that institutions build with insurers. So we have quite a good setup, and I'm never worried about insurance and insurance premiums.
Good. Okay. Josh, when we were talking about it, and again, I don't want to speak on his behalf, but just to say that he did want to say about raising this, it was more to do with things like loans. And he explained to me that in the past, when he was borrowing things for a collection, often someone would be traveling from New York, they'd put it in a case and bring it out with them or whatever else. And now it's much more a little bit, as Toby said earlier, with those things from the Palace Museum, the cases have to be so constructed that they cost thousands of dollars to construct. And then the insurance is thousands of dollars as well. It becomes so expensive just to borrow things now, whatever else.
Yes.
And so it makes a question about actually museums lending things between them.
Sustainability.
It's an issue. And that's all. Okay. I just, by the way, you said that Hong Kong museum visitors are civilized. And I think that's quite right. But you weren't contrasting that with the Philadelphia visitors to the museum there then. Nice civilization. Anyway.
I wasn't thinking, it wasn't a comparative analysis.
I should ask if anyone in the room has a question, because I haven't opened up for questions for anyone in the room. Have we got any questions for the panel on anything we've covered so far? Chris.
I have 2 questions following.
Yes, I have 2 questions which I would like to put first. This is, I understand that, well, the first question is, I understand that the French government has introduced a new law under which, in order to import anything into France, you need to have an original invoice. Would any member of the panel like to comment and say whether, would like to comment on that particular law?
I read about it.
Invoice of the item, either art or antiquity that's
The original invoice when the item was first sold.
Yeah, I read about that and I failed to interpret that because that seems like an impossible task.
Okay, you know, I think you have now answered my second question, which was going to be, how does one provide an original invoice from a society which had no writing at the time the original artwork was made? I know that one particular dealer who specializes in Chinese antiquities and items coming from, say, 3,000–4,000 years ago, when there was not yet a fully developed system of writing within China, put this question to the French government, and they said they would think about it. They have not yet replied.
But thank you very much. And I'm very pleased. I was looking around at some of my students and they looked as bemused as I'm feeling as well about what do you mean by an original receipt? It's yeah, as you say, for things that are thousands of years old or even a few hundred years old, how far back do we go for the receipts for these things? It sounds
sold.
Yeah.
Like the terracotta warriors, the Chinese government is the custodian of these in perpetuity for humanity. They should never be sold. So how do you then have a terracotta warrior exhibition in France?
But even for contemporary art,
Yeah.
if we get a donation from a living artist and we sign a deed of gift, so the ownership transfer agreement, is that a receipt?
I take it that would be. Again, I'm not sure, Chris. It's an interesting question, and I think I shall ask my students to look at that law.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be a good research question for them to have a look at that law and think about.
Well, I think we should bear in mind that, particularly in the example of the terracotta warriors, they were discovered only in 1974 when a farmer was accidentally digging his ploughed field and stumbled upon them. Before that, they are dated from the time of Qin Wang, which is 200 BC. From 200 BC to 1974 AD, they were totally secure.
Yes. Only afterwards was there a problem. Do we have any other questions in the room or online? Yes, gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thank you for the panels for sharing. I just have a question. Given of the limited budgets to the different museums, do you think that there is a trend that some of the museum may make replicates of the original and put it in the museum for exhibitions because that it may lower the amount for insurance or for securities? And do you think that is will become the trend in the coming years?
I think that's a very good question. Can I throw that out? Maybe Florian first.
I don't know, to be honest. Does anybody know of examples of that?
Yeah, I've seen quite a, yeah, there's
I
a
mean,
lot.
in mainland China,
Yeah.
Chris says. But for insurance purposes?
I understand that mainland Chinese museums have made modern replicas, especially of Chinese textiles. And these are often shown.
Yeah.
And I have seen some. I was also told a story about about the ceramic warriors that we have discussed. I understand that the Munich Museum paid a lot of money to China for a loan of the pottery warriors. And one of the warriors was broken, which was great embarrassment. But after the warrior was broken, it was discovered that the warrior was in fact a modern reproduction. So it was even more embarrassment for China.
So I think with reproduced textiles, I'm not entirely sure if they are shown to save insurance premium. It could be for conservation reasons.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I would do it for preservation reasons rather than to save a penny.
I think that is the case. I have also seen, I know that the Museum of Coastal Defense had an exhibition of Chinese military costumes, which I was looking forward to seeing. But they were all modern reproductions and not very good modern reproductions. They did have one original robe that was very good, but that was for a lady whom I suspect was never part of the military.
Yes, Sarah.
I don't know if, well, there was a question about it. Do we have examples of museums? And yes, Nanjing Museum has, to use your terminology, modern reproductions. Lushan Museum in the mainland has modern reproductions. To me, and some of the work I've recently been doing, I can't answer the question about insurance, but to come back to the point about cultural context, it's perceived to be almost irrelevant whether the object is a modern reproduction or the original, because it's actually not so much about the authenticity and the fabric, but about this is the representation of our culture. And it needn't matter if that is a representation of that terracotta warrior or the original terracotta warrior. But I'm very aware that replica warriors have been sent not only to Munich, but to various other places. And part of the reason for that is a concern over the safety of the object. So in this case, it's not about we're just showcasing our history, but actually we kind of don't trust the borrower to look after this.
Then it goes back to how the object is described to the public.
I agree. And I think this is a very significant point, that if we are showing something that is not an authentic original in its materiality, and particularly if we're showing this to people outside of our own culture who have different perceptions around what should be in a museum, that if it's not an original terracotta warrior and it says terracotta warrior with the chin date on it, then we need to be honest about if it's a reproduction or not and have a discussion about why.
Well, this is a very basic point as to why do people go to museums? What are museums there to serve people with? They're there to serve people with originals, not with copies.
In one perception, and I think this is the challenge, it's work I've started digging into about different cultures, different ethics and different perceptions around what is significant in art and archaeology. And what I've learned is that for some cultures, the materiality, that original item that's 1,000 years old, is less significant than demonstrating what that looked like and who made that, and the intangible cultural aspects of creation. So the social practices that produce that is more important than the physical object itself. And this harks back to discussions that Steve and I have had around the 2003 convention, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, and why this has been so widely ratified in Asia versus other conventions that are not so widely ratified, that require the protection of the material object, that those conventions then require not to be altered and changed and, you know, live and breathe with the culture, whereas the 2003 convention allows for living, changing cultures. In Europe, it's definitely about material authenticity, but a lot of other cultures is not the case.
With the China principles, we found sort of a halfway solution.
Yeah, agreed.
Good, thank you. Chris, I'm sorry, Cliff. I'm getting confused my C's. Cliff, thank you.
I just wanted to comment that the concept of museums is a very Western concept to begin with. And the idea of collecting memorabilia is also a very Western concept. So, for example, in the northwest of the Canadian British Columbia, a totem pole is not supposed to be in a museum. It's supposed to be created, and it dies because it's supposed to live a life. And the people there will actually create another one to replace it. And that's the whole idea. It's to show not that their culture has gone, but that culture continues. So I think we need to kind of look that there's not one model of museology. There are several models around. And there are museums like the museum in Qatar that's on slavery that actually has no objects, because the story of slavery is in the building itself, built by slaves, owned by a pearl merchant who employed slaves, and in the people of Qatar who are the result, in part, of slavery. So why does it actually need objects? So it's down to the story, if you're being educational about it, that you want to tell, or if not just educational, but a matter of, in this case, national pride, turning a very negative story like slavery into the building of a nation. And that doesn't actually require objects, because the nation is the nationals.
Yeah.
Right? So I think you got to rethink what a museum is and what its purpose is. And it could be all of the things you've described and more.
I'm going to take forward a point that Cliff kind of touched on but didn't raise explicitly, and that is these living objects. We actually discussed this a little bit yesterday, and that you see a lot of European museums. Belgium is a perfect example, where there's a lot of African artifacts that are sacred totems living in the various, well, from this one particular African culture. These are living objects with spirits. So they're displayed as artworks behind glass, and there's no interpretation about the culture and the meaning of this object and the spirit in terms of that particular African culture. And I think maybe this harks back to kind of Josh's point and Florian saying that, you know, to see something in 3D is really useful. But my sense is that these living, breathing objects that were living, breathing spirits in their own culture that would die and be reborn shouldn't be behind glass, because you're effectively putting somebody in a coffin, a spirit in a coffin, and trapping it in a culture that's not its own. And this is where I think we're having currently these challenges between what's a European perception of a museum potentially and what's, a perception in a different culture, and where we're getting objects of one culture in a museum of another. Maybe it's not appropriate to display objects of one culture in the way that they should be in the culture where they are being displayed, if that makes sense, because you're just taking out the meaning of those artifacts.
Well, Cliff's point is that it shouldn't be in the museum in the first
Yeah,
place.
exactly. But given that they're there because
They
of
can
the
be
history of colonialism and slavery and all of these other things, if they're not being restituted, and the Belgium example is, I think, found quite confronting, because there's a huge brass plaque we talked about yesterday at the front of this museum that says everything in this museum is owned by the Belgian government. And then you walk through the front door, and then in an attempt to consider provenance research, there's 3 examples of where they've done provenance research, only 3, in a museum of hundreds of thousands of objects. And one says, okay, this actually isn't owned by the Belgian government. Our provenance research shows this was stolen. And the other one is, our provenance research can't identify the provenance of this, but it's a very sacred African artifact in a glass cabinet in Belgium. And the other one says, oh yes, this is legitimate because our provenance research shows that the chief gave that to, the king or whatever. So, but this is 3 paces in from the sign that says everything here is owned by the Belgian government. Don't question us about colonialism and authenticity and repatriation. Oh, but here you go. Here's 2 examples already where we can't actually prove that these are owned by the Belgian government, but they are refusing to consider restoration, repatriation, or anything beyond that. We own that and we're not giving it back. And this is where hundreds of, if not thousands of sacred African artifacts are stuck behind glass and described based on their colours, not on what
the
that
whole
meant.
institution was founded for that purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I know the museum.
Yes. So I think we have to also accept that not everyone has our perception of, museums being born of Occidental philosophies, and these European versions of collecting might not translate, and we have to think about this differently than maybe we would in our own culture.
I think that brings us into our 3rd panel. We probably need to move in because we're going to start talking about repatriations, restitutions as well. Welcome back to our 3rd and final panel. Things have overrun a little bit, but that's because there's been so much to talk about. So thank you very much for all those questions earlier. The 3rd panel, I'll just do a brief introduction. We're going to talk about disposing of collections, conditions on donations. We've already touched on that at times. Restrictions on access, mandated display, deaccessioning and selling donations, and probably get into repatriation as well of items from private and public collections as well. So just to start, I thought if I can get that to move forward. Excellent. I would talk about a private collection where there became an issue about keeping it together. Just to mention this, the Butler family collection, I think you know a lot about this, Angus. This
I knew
particular
Mr. Michael Butler. He came to my office several times.
So Michael Butler, then an amazing collection of those transitional wares, isn't it? I think that was the
Yes.
And he formed this incredible collection with the purpose of keeping it together and sharing it with scholars who wanted to study it. So he set up his own museum. He put the collection on display and scholars could go there. And he also wanted the items to be able to be handled, to be able to be pick them up and again, to encourage scholarship in this particular period of Chinese porcelain, which was very little was known about it when he started to collect this. So it's a really interesting story. It's a passion for a collection. He published works about his collection as well. Unfortunately, when he died, a dispute arose over the collection because he had gifted some of his collection to his children. Again, there's the deed of gift that he made in 1987. If we think about the fact that this is in, of course, the United Kingdom, which has its particular laws to do with inheritance taxes and other things, this was probably good advice at the time to give some of this away during your lifetime. then to have that sort of taper tax relief that you can have for inheritance taxes in the UK. One of the great things about Hong Kong, by the way, is no capital taxation. You know, we can't stress enough what a wonderful thing that is.
Inheritance tax.
No inheritance taxes. So anyway, good advice, give the items away during your lifetime. But of course, when he died, the issues arose amongst his children, where 2 of his children wanted to sell their part of the collection and 2 did not. And there becomes a dispute. They end up in court. There's issues to do with whether there was a trust. I don't know if any of my students from my trust courses are here or whatever else. So the trust law came into this as well. Whether it was a gift, whether it was a trust, in the end, the judge, of course, says it's quite clearly it was a gift of these items. They belong to the children. If they want to sell them, then they can do. So problems with collections. For a collector, often they want to keep their collection together, or they want to see it pass on as a collection as well. It has value much more than the individual pieces. It has value as a collection. And I think for Sir Michael Butler, he wanted that, but it didn't happen. And it led to a quite fierce sort of family rift as well. Repatriation is a big issue that we probably touch on as well from museum and private collections. The Benin bronzes have been in the news for a number of years now. The issues to do with those. There are, of course, France was, and Macron was, of course, one of the first people to sort of move in Europe towards this idea of repatriation. He was the one who encouraged the report, or I think he commissioned a report into the Benin bronzes in France. I don't think many bronzes have been repatriated from France as a result of this. Other jurisdictions, private collections, I think notably a number of private collections, things have been returned. But again, there are even issues with the return of those. So maybe we'll touch on those as we go through. I'll mention certain things in public collections as well, which we should think about. The famous Chinese star chart. Many of you will have seen this sort of illustration. A few years ago at the Heritage Museum in Sha Tin, they had this on display. Well, they didn't have it on display, of course. They had a copy on display because the original, I think, is still in the British Library, isn't it? Where it's being cared for in the British Library or whatever else. And of course,
Kept by the keepers.
Kept by the keepers. I think that's for it. And then, of course, the Tashong horses. If you do go to Xi'an, if you go to see the Terracotta Army, which I recommend to anyone, absolutely wonderful to go and see that. But also the Stellai Museum is a wonderful museum as well. And when I first saw these, I was very impressed. I thought they were absolutely wonderful, but I couldn't understand why 2 of them were undamaged and the others were damaged. And then, of course, when I read the little plaque, it explained to me that those 2, of course, were copies because the originals were in, I think they're in Philadelphia, or in the Penn Museum in America as well. And also in Hong Kong, we've got some interesting things in museums. It's not your museum, Florian. It's the Heritage Museum. If you go to the Heritage Museum, one of my favorite artifacts there is this amazing clock. As everyone knows, British and particularly London clockmakers were the best clockmakers in the world. And this is a London-made clock from the end of the 18th century, stunning work of art. One of the clocks that probably was being sent to China to try and ingratiate with the emperor at the time, to try and encourage the emperor to trade with the British. And rather than just ask for silver, maybe we can give you a few trinkets or something instead. If you do go to the Palace Museum in Beijing, by the way, the clock room there is one of the most magnificent collections I've ever seen. It's a place I could spend all day just looking at those clocks. So this clock is wonderful.
I'm a suspicious person.
I'm already on the list. I think the AI would have me there.
Said on behalf of the Emperor Qianlong to Lord Macartney, who brought along these gifts, including this clock, was that we do not care for your trinkets or rubbish. We do not want them. Please go. And that's why they're still in China and highly treasured now.
Well, they are, yes. It's a wonderful collection. But I don't think you can see this. If you do look at the information which gives some provenance, of course, this was a private collector who purchased this clock, but he purchased it from Madame Chiang Kai-shek in New York, from her apartment in New York. And of course, it does raise the question of how it ended up in New York, doesn't it really? And how it could be sold privately. The good news, of course, it is now in Hong Kong, in China. But yeah, when I do look at it in the Heritage Museum, I do sort of question whether it is appropriate to be there or whether it should be back in Beijing or perhaps in the Palace Museum in West Kowloon. Perhaps that would be more appropriate. Anyway, we can talk about these things later on.
Surely, if everything should be repatriated to the country of origin, surely they should all go back to Britain.
I have argued that with my students. Chris has made that very good point, where I have said, you know, these things are London. They should actually not go back to Britain. They should go back to London, Chris, actually. London clockmakers, the best in the world.
But
Okay,
if it's a gift.
I'm not sure. We you know, remember these particular gifts, we have to question about the sort of the pressures that were on at the time. The British were desperate for the trade. So
Maybe these pieces could go to the British Museum.
perhaps they should go to the British
exchange
Museum.
some of
They
the-
could be exchanged for something else.
Tonight.
Actually, and now another interesting thing that's already been touched about is conditions on gifts. So again, the museums, I think, are very careful today. I will show you this slide. I'm very wary of this. This particular quote comes from a very well-respected book on the history of museums. But every time I try and find the authority for this, it's a problem. So there is this reported in a very, very well-respected book on museums that a collection was accepted for California's Huntington Library with the following condition: never to be used by women, closed to any individuals of British extraction, closed to Jews, Roman Catholics, and the donor's nephew. Which, of course, raises the issue, what did the nephew do? But again, I'm not sure. When I check with AI can't find this quote for me anyway, any authority for it, except for this particularly.
I think there's more questions about the Huntington Library accepting something
Well-
with such conditions.
Well,
does it?
museums and libraries did. They accepted. And again, a lot of these conditions, by the way, to do with collections around the world have been struck down under laws to do with discrimination today. So they would have been.
No,
But,
aren't these Huntington's own words? Because
they-
this is Huntington's nephew, right?
I
think-
don't know. Is
yeah.
that the issue? Was it
Would
the
be.
nephew?
Because he left the collections to the institution.
Ah, okay. So maybe.
I don't know for sure, but I think
I don't know if
most
this is one that they
because he
accepted.
collected libraries, not
Mm,
books, but
that's-
libraries, and then created this institution.
But again, to try and find some authority behind this, apart from the one quote in one book, it's very difficult to find. So, but
That's
there
interesting.
many collections around the world have been subject to conditions. A lot of them have been struck down where they seem to be discriminatory today.
I would be one of the few people who could actually look at this.
You should actually, because this is and the donor's nephew. So never to be used by the donor's nephew.
yeah. I think
it's-
today
I think
most
it's really
things would be
Huntington's.
struck down. The only person who probably couldn't go to see it today would be the donor's nephew. I think that's the only one you could probably uphold as a condition, couldn't you? Although conditions on gifts are also problematic. Yes, definitely. We talk about conditions on
The
gifts.
nephew passed.
And then deaccession, museums, deaccession, taking them out of the collection. Deaccessioning is taking something out of your collection. And in particular, most controversially, then selling things off. I thought I'd give you a couple of examples. This is one of my favorites. So this is a little bit different because usually what you've got is something being given to the collection and then the issue of it being deaccessioned. But this was the Palace Museum, again, which bought 5 letters. So they didn't get, this is slightly different. They weren't given these, but they would have used, of course, the museum's money. It's public money, so it becomes part of the collection. They bought these 5 letters, as it says there, for 6.82 million yuan back in 1997. And then in 2005, they sold them for 22.9 million. At the time, this attracted a lot of criticism. But again, when I discuss this with my students, I say, this is such good business. As a former antiques dealer, I'm thinking, wow, well done. But should museums be trading in items? Maybe we can come to that shortly. Oh, Florian. And
I'm
then
very jealous.
many collections around the world, famous things. In particular, in the United Kingdom, we had a whole range of Chinese artifacts that had been donated many years ago to either local authority museums or, in one case, a university museum, subject to conditions that they should be kept and then put on display for the people or for the students of the university, which suddenly these institutions found were worth incredible amounts of money because of the boom in the price for Chinese antiquities in particular. So this was a London council. This is Croydon in South London. So those of us from South London know Croydon quite well. It's not a place I recommend to many people to go to, but Croydon Council discovered that it had this moon vase in its collection. The usual story, apparently they were asking about insurance valuations, and of course a valuer came along from one of the auction houses and gasped when he saw this and said, oh my goodness, and they sold it. And at the time, a lot of people in the London Borough of Croydon, surprisingly, objected to this sale. They said, but this was given to us. This is for us to enjoy. And Croydon Council said, we can build something with this. We can repair something with this. So again, that raises the issue of selling. And then, of course, famously, the Thornhill Stem Cup, which was sold in Hong Kong for 41 million Hong Kong dollars. Given by the collector, Edward Thornhill, I believe he was a chemist, and he gave it to what became Staffordshire University, subject to conditions that it should be, they should retain the collection, and at all reasonable times, the college students and any other person will be able and allowed to study the pottery and porcelain pieces by handling them. I have in mind the procedures followed in libraries with books. So again, very similar to Sir Michael Butler, the idea that he wanted people to study these things. Staffordshire University again had one of these valuations where, of course, again, the valuer gasped when he saw this, and then they decided to sell it. Again, controversial at the time. For us, interesting that it was actually sold in Hong Kong. In recent years, lots of opposition to selling things from museums. This is the Berkshire Museum in Massachusetts. When they decided to, they repurposed. They decided that they wanted to change their purpose as a museum. They wanted to focus more on the STEM, on sciences and other things, and be more educational. So that touches on what we talked about earlier. They decided they wanted to deaccession and sell off items, including some major important works by major important American artists. When they did so, again, in the end, they had to go to court to actually fight for the right to do this. They then were, I think, ejected from the American Museums Association because the American Museums Association said, we don't agree with this. When they did sell off one of their major works, by the way, they did sell it to another museum, subject to an agreement that it could be loaned between them at one point as well. But it lost them a lot of support, and it lost them, well, it lost the membership of the American Museums Association as well. These were some of the other items they were selling off as well. And I thought one of the final points to raise on the selling of collections was this. The Florence and Herbert Irving gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including some American amazing jades and other things. When that came up for sale...
Too late for you.
Bought that, Angus.
Not interested.
This isn't the good jade then, is it? So, but again, you know, these people have been incredible donors to the museum. They had endowed a whole wing of the museum. Then they gift everything to them. When they come to sell it, people did question this. And the Met very quickly said, at the time of the gift, they realized that a full assessment of the collection would take time. There would undoubtedly be many pieces that would unnecessarily duplicate works already in the collection. For that reason, they agreed that the Met could sell any of the works in their gift so long as the proceeds would go towards future acquisitions. The present sale is a fulfillment of that visionary goal. So they had quite clearly agreed that things could be sold. And just as a final point, something maybe we can think about, we've started to talk about disputes involving museums and private collections. One thing I'd like to suggest for the future for Hong Kong, particularly those lawyers in the room, is to think about the future of Hong Kong as an arbitration centre for art. There is a court of arbitration for art. It is in The Hague. But I think Hong Kong's position, major art market, Asia itself probably needs local knowledge, local expertise to be involved. Something for the future to suggest a court of arbitration for art in Hong Kong.
Let's do it.
Yes, let's go for it. Anyway, let's start discussing some of those. Thanks, Jay. We'll move into the questions. Florian, deaccessioning to sell. What do you think?
It's a big problem. It's a big problem because of the trust issue. I mean, it's an ethical issue rather than a law issue, I think. And I think it potentially makes it very difficult for a museum that deaccessions to continue to collect by donation. So it depends. I think the solution that the Met described in that on your final slide there, I think that is one that is probably the most acceptable. If the money, the proceeds from the sale, if it's a public sale at auction and the proceeds are used to buy art, in this case, I think they would carry the same credit line. So the funds would be the family, the original donors' funds, because the Met has other examples where objects that were purchased after a donor passed carry the same credit line, and they were acquired with funds from
that donation.
From that donation. I've heard of, I owe my career to the Met, I say that. But also in my second job, after I left the Met, we had a similar situation there too, that the collection that was donated was so large that the museum agreed with the donor that pieces could be sold to acquire, again, in the donor's name, other pieces of art. If, like the Berkshire Museum did it, or other museums did it or try to do it, museums sell art to repair the roof or pay the staff, I think that is a lot less acceptable.
Can I just say, by the way, I did write about this in the past, and my conclusion was that it was unacceptable, that it shouldn't be done. My opinion did change slightly during COVID, because I know there were some museums that were having real problems paying their staff and other things. And it did go through my head at that point that perhaps if you have got duplicates, if you have got things that are redundant for the collection, if that actually keeps the museum going at that point, I thought there was an argument there.
Yeah, and duplicates are an interesting topic, or for that matter, objects that came to the museum and were never exhibited. Right. So some of the 19th century problems that we already referred to earlier, and I've seen it in London, I'm not going to name the museum, I've seen it in New York, where the museums collected quite fast in the 19th century after they were set up, and they refined their collecting strategies later on, and then realized that there are whole collections that have never been of true interest to the museum. And the collection I came across in London, I think, should be repatriated to a different country. And other collections, like including at the Met, were never shown for 100 years and were sold at public auction, actually about 12 or 15 years ago. So there are examples, but then those funds at the Met went back into the acquisitions budget.
Maybe we can follow up now with Angus as a collector. You've already explained to us that you're a little bit disappointed with the British Museum taking your collection and then taking it off display. If the British Museum were to say, we're going to sell this, how would you feel?
I would want it back.
Can I ask, did you put any conditions?
No, it was not a conditional gift. They would not have accepted a conditional gift. So it's theirs. But they really should display it, because the whole function of a museum is to display what you have whenever you can. And the display of Thai ceramics, it doesn't exist anymore. They're none on display.
Well, following up on that, we mentioned earlier the gift of the Sir Percival David Foundation to the British Museum. Of those pieces have been on loan, but the purpose of the Sir Percival David Foundation, it was a trust that was set up,
yes,
with an obligation, which the trustees acknowledge, that the pieces were to the purposes of the foundation were to preserve intact his unique collection, to keep every single piece on public display together, and to ensure that the collection would remain an inspiration and education for future generations. So again, the British Museum, you said they don't want to take things with conditions, but surely, I mean, for me, if that's the foundation is set up with that purpose, those pieces are subject to that condition anyway. It's a trust obligation which must be passed on.
Well, I had faith and trust. Both have been disparaged.
Many people would agree
yes,
about the British Museum, and not just in that regard. the fact that they've had significant thefts allegedly from staff. They're not repatriating objects that are being requested for repatriation. Dan Hicks has written a book on the British Museum, found a play on the word the British Museum, because of the behaviour of the museum and of how many of its objects came to be. So I think there's a lot more at play with the British Museum than simply not respecting the benefits of a donation or the conditions of a
yes, but
unconditional
I think it's a problem for many museums. Let's be a little bit. I want to be a little bit fair to the British Museum, because many museums have the same problem. So few museums will accept conditional gifts. Right? I just had the discussion 10 days ago. Unconditional, not a long-term loan, to make it easy for the future, right? The other problem, though, is that we cannot go with fashions. So if Thai ceramics are not so hip in 2026, that shouldn't determine what happens to them. And especially, of course, with deaccessioning.
Yeah.
Right? If we think we have too much of one thing for true, sustainable reasons, that's fine. Some museums, and I see we have about 80% of the audience in the room is female. Some museums have deaccessioned works by male artists to buy works by female artists because of the historical imbalance of collecting works by male artists. Is that a fashion? I don't know. I think we are all in favor of that. But, that I'm just saying, so there are always social reasons for potentially reasons like that to determine the direction that a museum goes to. And I think it's really important for museums to not, I'm in favor of buying female artists, but to think this through and not say, 21st century, we want to be super equal to all. And in this case, it works, but in other cases, maybe they should have a case of Thai ceramics. I'm all in favor. We show 2 or 3 pieces in our Chinese museum. You've given them to the wrong place.
Maybe you can ask the British Museum. Maybe they need to move them over to the Hong Kong U, or maybe Josh. I should be informed.
I have given things to your museum.
I know.
And you still have them. Why is that? You can sell them.
We wouldn't do that.
This is good. I like.
In store raises questions too. I can't speak for Angus as a donor, but if there are more objects than are able to be displayed, I know there's an assumption that if it's in the store, then never to be seen again and never to be accessed, and what a waste. But as a researcher, often maybe Cliff would agree with me, what's in the store is often
more accessible.
Yeah, more accessible, because it's almost impossible to get something off display. And even a local museum wanted to charge me personally 45,000 Hong Kong dollars a day to get something out of cabinets.
Oh.
Yeah,
what?
we can. Yeah,
I'm working for the wrong museum.
Yeah, we did. It wasn't paid. It was settled out of court. But I think we have to be careful that if it's in a store, it's not gone forever. Researchers can still access that.
And others. But if the collection inventory is available for people to access, so they know that material's there, like a library, you can search the catalogue. But a lot of museums don't have, smaller museums particularly, don't have available kind of inventories in which you can search to know what might be in the store or not. And I think this is when having something in the store becomes problematic from a research point of view.
Sorry, Chris,
would like to ask a question.
Can we get a microphone? Sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you, Chris.
If a gift is made with conditions, how are the conditions enforced after the donor dies if the museum chooses to ignore them?
Okay, I'm looking around for some of my students to answer this one. That's all. But anyone want to take this one, or shall I? I can say. I mean, again, my understanding would be, Chris, it would depend how the gift. I mean, if it's a gift with conditions, generally the common law doesn't accept gifts with conditions. You know, we don't have a gift for a second. We have a gift or not. So if you put conditions on it, for me, it's a trust. And then you have to think about the trust principles to do with this. If this is a public trust, if it's a charitable trust, well, then the Secretary for Justice would enforce the conditions. But if it's a condition where it reverts to private ownership, that becomes more of a problem. Hong Kong, of course, has a benefit, by the way. If anyone's thinking of giving things to our museums, or even to, not the public museums, even the private museums or whatever else.
The university museums.
The university museums in particular. Remember that we don't have a rule against perpetuities in Hong Kong. So you can we don't have to worry about things like how long conditions can go on for or anything else. But yeah, it is an issue. If it's interpreted as a public trust, then the Secretary for Justice would enforce. If it's a private matter, then I take it's the estate of the deceased would enforce it. I can see my colleague Jonathan is nodding next to me, next to Chris there as well. So Jonathan, have you got any comments on this? Would you say?
No.
Oh, okay. I was going to bring you up onto the panel.
No, the question that I have is sort of, it's the question of sort of who, as time goes on and you lose track of who is the ultimate beneficiary of the estate of the donor, then I think it gets very diffuse, right? Because, how do you, one generation, it's fine, who the issue are, but then as you go, 3 or 4 generations, there could be very many people who are entitled to enforce, and who's more entitled to enforce than the other.
I think that's quite. I think Jonathan and I co-teach on a property law. I think this would be a good exam question, don't you think, Jonathan?
It'd be a great exam question, but not for this summer, because
no.
anyone in the room already knows about it.
Okay. Yes. Any more questions from the floor while we're yes, thank you, lady there.
Oh, thank you. So I'm a museum studies student, so not quite familiar with laws. So I just want to ask, like, for the cases like Benny bronzes or the Cambodia sculptures, for those like repatriation cases, and also for some like restitution cases, like the paintings from Nazi period. At what stage will the legal team get involved in this kind of repatriation or restitution cases?
Does anyone on the panel?
Thank you.
The legal team.
Do you mean when it will actually go to court? It will depend on the jurisdiction on whether the laws apply. Remember, if we're talking about a lot of these sort of historic incidents, then there are no laws. Well, it's difficult to think of laws that would actually apply. To do with the Nazi looted items, it depends where you are, because certain jurisdictions have special laws now that deal with those.
Yeah, there's the Washington Principles as well, which cover the Nazi restitution, and a number of countries have basically, in principle, agreed to those, and have set up commissions as well. And it's about just and fair outcomes, and making archives open and all sorts of conditions with these principles. And then they got sort of reissued again just recently by the Czech government. So it's a bit like conventions with regards to UNESCO and UNIDROIT. There are things out there that exist for the legal purposes, but once it gets to courts and litigation, and things get very complicated. So yeah.
I think most of the time it doesn't get to court.
Yeah.
These things are usually negotiated, and again, it's often not even negotiated by the parties. It's governments that put pressure on public institutions at times, or even on private collectors.
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Principles have one part is that it should, all action should be taken to get to mediation and to not get to court.
Yeah.
That's one of the key tenets of those principles.
Mediation or arbitration, I think.
Yeah, in Hong Kong.
And I can speak to Cambodia in that actually it's the Cambodian government's wish not only to have all of the material that was looted during the Khmer Rouge regime returned, but there was an express wish from the most senior people in government that there be no legal action taken, that this is done on a request and negotiation basis. So this is intentional from the Cambodians.
Any more questions from the floor at the moment? I mean, it's great. Thank you very much for bringing us into repatriation, because I think we need to think about this now. Many museums in the world now have very active policies looking into their collections, and they also have a policy to do with repatriation. Do all museums, no, you can't speak in Hong Kong, do Hong Kong museums have these things?
I don't know. I think most museums in Hong Kong and mainland China in the region collect Chinese art, and only Chinese art, or predominantly Chinese art. So I think that vis-a-vis the encyclopedic museum, like the BM, of course, is a very different institution. And so I think we see less research done in Greater China, if you like, into museum collections than in other parts of the world that have international art.
Because it's such a thorny issue for both museums and also when they're faced with claimants on issues, and especially with historical issues, it really is very difficult for either a board of trustees to make decisions. There might be laws, like in the British Museum case with the Parthenon marbles, but something that's just happened quite recently, which is a work between the Institute of Art and Law and Oxford University, is to help with this question of restitution of cultural artifacts. Is they've just come up recently and released a free online ethics tool, and it's called DARCA, D-A-R-C-A, and it's the decision aid for the restitution of cultural artifacts. And this is a guide to help with museums to be able to answer questions that are difficult to answer, but with a very set of structured questions. And I can give you a couple or a few that are number of issues. So it will consider, for example, the relationship between the claimant and the artifacts, the cultural value of the object to the claimant, how the artifact came into the museum's possession, the cultural importance of the artifact in its current setting, whether the claimant could care for and publicly display the artifact, whether the return would improve or access or understanding, and any obstacles the claimant faces in accessing the artifact. Now, it's an ethics decision aid. It is not a decision maker. It does not give legal advice. It does not deal with Nazi art or any Jonathan's field of dead bodies and things like that. But I think this is moving in the right direction, and that it's recently in the last few months just been released. So I'm not sure that anyone is actually using it yet, but it is there. And I think, like when we embrace new technologies or where AI can help, for example, this is something else that has come online, if you like, and is there to be used to answer those difficult questions, but in a very impartial way. And it's not necessarily that it's going to give an answer.
I think in a very European way, though.
I want to say
I have problems with that.
Having strong objections to that for exactly this point. That's a very Eurocentric approach to value and significance, and it's really not the way that many cultures outside the UK and Europe perceive objects.
Actually, I think continental Europe is a much further ahead this is a colonial tool to keep things in the UK. Because to put in there that if the country that receives the object back cannot display it properly or has to justify what it means to their indigenous culture is purely meant for Oxford to keep it, and the Ishmaelian has repatriated hardly anything.
And they have been
really
criticized heavily for not repatriating.
Well, I raise it for discussion. I mean, don't shoot the messenger.
Shooting messenger, I think this is the kind of thing we should be discussing, because it's like I just think of all the cultures outside of the UK that I have worked with, and the way that even the terminology is used is very Anglo, like value, right? And it's based on a principle that cultural heritage is private property. And now we get to the heart of the seminar, whereas there's a lot of arguments around cultural heritage not being private property. It's a public good, it's common heritage of humankind, it can't be owned. And here we are, like, value, not even significance. Like, there's huge amounts of work by David Throsby and others on the economics of heritage, and it does not prescribe individual financial value. This is Oxford. To all my friends at Oxford, it's not a criticism, but I think this is just blind to how other cultures deem heritage, and privileging in its own language institutions that can display appropriately and can demonstrate value. Like, to Cliff's point, some things should never be in a museum and they don't have a value, like they're spiritual objects of belief. How do you put a price on that?
I think other jurisdictions are further along. Other countries are further along.
I agree with Florian on that. That's very Anglo-centric. And
Well, thank you for raising that one, Toby.
Yes.
Well, you can put it into your art law class.
I will do. I'll bring that in. I quite like the fact that you referred to the marbles as the Parthenon marbles as well. So that's your opinion, is it, on there? Are you identifying them in that way that that they should be repatriated?
I had the privilege of sitting inside one of your classes, Steve, and so I think the answer to that is how you described the issue of the Elgin marbles, and you can explain.
No, I just
it was Mr. Hitchens, I think his view.
That's it. I like Christopher Hitchens' idea. It's not a matter of blame. It's not a matter of ownership. It is where would they look best, and he suggested under the same sun where they were actually originally displayed would be that.
The Elgin marbles is problematic too, right?
That's why I was a bit worried about Toby going on to the Parthenon marbles. I thought this is it. I think we have to be well. Chris, do you want to come in with your? Cliff, would you want to come in with your point? You had a question you wanted to raise, and unfortunately, you wanted me to show a photograph, but I can't show the photograph at the moment. But can you describe?
Let me go back to my question. I wasn't sure if I was going to make it here on time today, so I did send a question in, and it's Steve, the issue of provenance and ethics. Does an African grave marker deserve less respect than a European headstone or a Chinese hunping? And this came out of me noticing that a lot of African objects have come on the market, both in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong, because it's a major antiques trading hub. But there's no provenance to a lot of these things. And I went online, and within 2 minutes, I found an object from my native Kenya on sale here in Hong Kong, which is a grave marker of the Giriama people, which is actually illegal to take out of Kenya. So that's what prompted my question, because it seems that there is no control over what's on the market and the context to it. And I mean, I'm talking about what I've seen in Hong Kong, but it could apply to other parts of Asia too, or other parts of the world too. So that was my
If
point.
you name the auction house, we lose the last few online participants.
Thanks.
We've still got quite a few hundred there, so you're okay. We're doing. You can, and anyway, I'm sure they're happily sitting there if they are there listening.
I think this raises also a question, and it points back to Toby's point, is whose ethics? We're saying this is an ethical guide, but this is very much British ethics. And Cliff's raised a point about the ethics around that. Shouldn't the ethics of the originating culture be considered, and what's appropriate for the originating culture, particularly if it should never have been out of the country in the first place?
I think that's it. But we raised this earlier, that all of those wonderful tomb warriors and everything else that we see for sale in Hollywood Road, they all come from tombs. That's why they're called tomb guardians and everything else. They were never intended to remove from the tomb.
But there's another issue, the legal issue of, for example, when those items were removed from Kenya, were they removed when it was still a British colony? Are those laws that you've quoted, those are new nation state of Kenya laws, cultural heritage laws? So if the object then it can be shown that it left British East Africa or Kenya before obviously independence, which are then obviously before 1970 in the UNESCO conventions, is it then legal to be the possessor and to then sell them on the open market? I mean, you bring in ethics, and this is the problem. It's ethics and the law. Yeah.
We don't what's the time when it actually appeared or how.
Yeah, the object that's being sold doesn't come with provenance.
It's being sold as a piece of art rather than the grave marker. So, it's selling something under a title that it was never intended to be.
Yeah. As most of the earlier Belgium museum I mentioned, all of those spiritual objects are described as in their artistic characteristics, not what it was. Doesn't say anything about what they were used for, what they mean to the local community. And so actually the museum in some ways could be accused of not doing its job by not interpreting those objects for the public. And then they can't say they're following a new materialist approach, which is the object speaks for itself, because they're actually describing it in terms of artistic form.
Good. Well, again, just to come in on that and make a comment about this, many of us here have been to Thailand, hopefully. And when you come to the airport in Thailand, you will see big posters up saying, Buddha is not an ornament. Buddha, and images of Buddha are not to be taken out of Thailand for decoration purposes. But there's a mass industry in producing Buddhas for decoration. And, go around in the galleries in Hong Kong, there are lots of Buddhas there that are for decoration. As Toby said, what actually the restrictions in particular jurisdictions, and then how it works outside of those jurisdictions. Well, it often doesn't. That's all. Any more questions from the floor? Anyone coming? Yeah, Jonathan's back in.
A little bit of a provocative question that leads out of the dispute between you and Toby, right? Which is
the argument.
But my question is about: is there any value in a museum of questionable repute as a collection of questionable repute? It's a little bit like Toby's question about should we have a museum of fakes. Is the fact that there was a collection that was curated or put together at a time when the collecting practices were problematic, is that something that is actually a teaching opportunity to say, here's a collection of items and they are tainted, but this is a representation of the culture of collecting and the culture of museums at the time that things were more murky, or where the collecting practices was this Eurocentric approach.
I know you're looking at me, but I'm going to suggest that Florian.
I give you one example.
Make you feel attacked.
It's all your fault.
Oh, I can speak a lot to that, but I'm not the museum director. My fantastic colleague.
No,
here is.
Reminds me of one temporary exhibition that I saw a year ago in the Anthropology Museum in Hamburg in Germany that has a collection of Benin bronzes. And they did an exhibition of all the Benin bronzes they have. And they did just that. in a temporary exhibition. I think quite a long temporary exhibition, but it's not a museum. It is inside the museum, but it's not a museum dedicated to this cause. But they were very open about that. There was a lot of provenance research on view. Everything was described in a very 21st century way, very open, very clear, adorable, a wonderful example.
I just feel like there are sometimes I worry that, okay, you say, well, this idea of having things be available on display, will people be able to see them? That there's something that gets lost when you break up a collection, that what that collection actually represents as a collection might get lost and so, you know, maybe there's a middle ground, and recognizing that cultural heritage is something that has been abused and taken and you know, for private purposes or for so-called public purposes, that's actually a representation of European culture in a way, and maybe we should know that.
I would support Florian's comment in that actually in a lot of these museums, you can't change the past, right? I think if that's the takeaway, one of the takeaways from today, we can't change what happened. And we can't judge the past by today's standards, to be cliche, but we can respond to that. So knowing that there's a global move towards reconsidering these collections, knowing that we're trying to move to decolonial approaches across the board in kind of archaeology and cultural heritage and museums, I think what Florian has described is the only, to use this challenging word too, ethical, but the only ethical way to deal with it, to say, this is how it came into our collection. This is how it's been displayed. This might be totally inappropriate given talking about African artifacts, for example, that this should not be displayed behind glass. It's kind of suffocating the spirits of their ancestors. But look, we've done this work. We recognize that's not how it would be done today. Let's engage with that conversation. See how the museum stakeholders respond to that, and potentially that being a starting point for then further conversations with the originating communities about what should happen with these and where should they go, should they stay, should, you know, ... what's next. But from an archaeologist, breaking up a collection is like breaking up an assemblage is a big no-no. And that's where we also have to think about the difference in professions and the difference in kind of codes of conduct, and what's acceptable in one context might not be acceptable in another. And that's also problematic, because if we can't agree on what's the right way to deal with an artifact, then, you know, it makes more detailed discussions like the one we're trying to have today challenging too.
Any more comments on this? Any more questions from the floor?
Thank you. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and really astute question. I think these are the kinds of things we should be raising, because it affects, if not already everyone in the room, it will affect people that are working in museums and cultural heritage at some point in your career, if not already.
Well, I think, Jonathan, we should have got you into a panel. We should have had a panel on dead bodies and museums and private collections of the dead. Would have been maybe something for the future.
We'll do that next Wednesday.
Yeah. We'll bringing that in. Thank you to our panel once again, to Mr. Angus Forsyth for his expertise as a connoisseur and his exposition on jades that he gave us earlier on, and everything else, all the other comments as a collector and also as a lawyer as well. To Dr. Florian Knothe as a museum professional and talking on behalf of museums everywhere at times. To Professor Sarah Ward, thank you for talking as an archaeologist and also in other vested forms. And then finally, Mr. Toby Bull, who gave us his perspective from a sort of law enforcement, security, various other issues as well that was commenting on. So can we thank the panel for their contributions today? And then thank you very much for everyone online. We were over 700 at times online. So thank you for everyone joining us. And then thank you to everyone in the room. It's very nice to see people in here and get the interactions. Thank you for the great questions that came in. And yeah, you've definitely made me think that we need to organise some future events, but maybe we'll do shorter, more focused events in the future. It's a bit of a marathon today, but thank you for everyone for joining. Thank you.
Thank you to you. Thank you, CUHK Law.
Also, I'll say thank you to Jay, who has worked really
yes.
tirelessly behind the scenes.
Thank you, Sarah. Quite right. Thank you, Jay, and the team. Thank you.